The discovery of a small lead token in the Thames mud during excavations near Southwark in 1973 revealed an unexpected window into London's medieval past. Its surface bearing the crude inscription of a goose and a series of marks that archaeologists would later identify as representing one of the most enduring yet deliberately obscured aspects of English urban life. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The establishment of formalized prostitution in England began not with the Anglo-Saxons or medieval Christians, but with the Roman occupation that commenced in earnest under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, when legions crossing from Gaul brought with them the sophisticated urban infrastructure and social customs that had characterized Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The Romans, with their pragmatic approach to human sexuality and their well-developed legal frameworks for regulating commercial activities of all types, established the first documented pleasure houses in the settlements that would eventually become major English cities. Archaeological evidence from Londinium, the Roman settlement that would become London, reveals the existence of structures that served explicitly sexual commercial purposes, identifiable through their architectural layouts, the artifacts recovered from their sites, and the graffiti preserved on their walls. These early establishments, known as lupanaria in Latin, were typically located in districts near military garrisons, trading ports, and major thoroughfares where transient populations created steady demand for their services. The physical layout of Roman brothels followed standardized patterns developed throughout the empire, featuring small individual rooms arranged along corridors, with stone or wooden beds built into the walls and doorways deliberately designed to be narrow and low, both for structural reasons and to create an atmosphere of intimate enclosure. The walls of these establishments were frequently decorated with explicit frescoes depicting various sexual acts, serving both as advertisement for the services available and as a form of menu for clients who might not share a common language with the workers, a practical consideration in the cosmopolitan environment of Roman Britain, where soldiers, merchants, and slaves from across the empire mingled in urban centers. The economic organization of Roman prostitution in Britain reflected the highly stratified nature of Roman society, with enslaved women and men forming the vast majority of sex workers, their bodies considered property to be exploited by their owners for profit. The legal status of prostitutes in Roman Britain mirrored the regulations established throughout the empire, where sex work was legal and regulated, but considered morally degrading, with practitioners losing certain civic rights and being subject to special taxation systems that acknowledged their trade while extracting revenue from it. Roman authorities maintained detailed records of registered prostitutes, who were required to declare their profession to local magistrates and wear distinctive clothing that marked their status in public spaces, typically including togas of specific colors that respectable Roman women were forbidden from wearing. The registration system served multiple purposes, including taxation collection, disease control through periodic inspections, and the maintenance of social hierarchies that preserved the distinction between respectable citizens and those engaged in shameful occupations. The location of Roman brothels in British settlements followed patterns observed throughout the empire, with establishments concentrated in specific districts that became known for vice and entertainment, separated from the residential areas occupied by respectable families, but positioned to capture traffic from commercial and military zones. In Londinium, archaeological evidence suggests that brothels clustered in the areas south of the Thames and near the docks, where sailors, soldiers, and travelling merchants provided a constant stream of customers whose temporary presence in the city made them ideal clients for commercial sex. The pricing structures for Roman brothel services in Britain remain partially documented through various sources, including graffiti that occasionally recorded costs, legal documents discussing regulations, and literary references in works that circulated throughout the empire. The standard price for basic services appears to have been relatively modest, equivalent to the cost of a loaf of bread or a cup of cheap wine, making prostitution accessible to men across the economic spectrum, though higher-class courtesans who operated independently rather than in brothels commanded substantially higher fees for their companionship and sexual services. The workers in Roman brothels lived under conditions of extreme exploitation, with enslaved prostitutes having no control over their working conditions, unable to refuse clients, and subject to physical punishment if they failed to generate sufficient income for their owners. The daily routine of a Roman brothel worker involved long hours of availability, with establishments typically operating from late afternoon through the night, serving clients who arrived after completing their business or military duties. The physical toll of this work was severe, with women and men subjected to repeated sexual encounters with multiple partners daily, often without adequate time for rest or recovery, and with minimal attention to their health or well-being beyond what was necessary to maintain their value as commercial assets. Disease was endemic in Roman brothels, with sexually transmitted infections spreading rapidly through populations that had limited understanding of disease transmission and no effective treatments for most ailments. The social stigma attached to prostitution in Roman Britain was profound and lasting, with individuals who engaged in sex work, even temporarily, marked permanently as infames under Roman law, losing the right to marry citizens, to testify in legal proceedings, and to hold any public office or position of honor. This legal degradation extended even to the owners and operators of brothels, who, despite often achieving considerable wealth through their businesses, occupied a paradoxical position in Roman society as simultaneously prosperous and disreputable. The cultural attitudes toward brothels in Roman Britain reflected the complex and contradictory Roman approach to sexuality, which acknowledged and accommodated male sexual desires while maintaining strict expectations of female chastity and fidelity, creating a system where prostitution was simultaneously necessary and shameful, utilized by respectable men while degrading those who provided the services. The religious dimensions of Roman prostitution included connections to certain temple practices and festivals, though the extent to which sacred prostitution existed in Roman Britain remains debated among historians, with some evidence suggesting that certain religious observances involved ritual sexual activities, while other scholars argue these connections have been exaggerated in later interpretations. The physical remains of Roman brothels discovered through archaeological excavations provide tangible evidence of how these establishments operated, with artifacts including oil lamps, ceramic vessels used for washing, coins that accumulated in the buildings, jewelry and personal items lost or discarded, and occasionally the skeletal remains of individuals who died in these locations and were buried nearby. The analysis of these skeletal remains has provided information about the health, nutrition, and life expectancy of brothel workers, revealing patterns of physical stress, inadequate diet, and relatively young age at death that paint a grim picture of the realities behind the commercial sexual exchange. The gradual decline of Roman authority in Britain during the 4th and 5th centuries AD disrupted the urban infrastructure that had supported brothels. As cities shrank or were abandoned, military garrisons withdrew, and the economic systems that had sustained commercial sex work collapsed. The departure of Roman legions around 410 AD marked the end of the organized, legally regulated brothel system that had existed for over 3 centuries, though prostitution itself certainly continued in various forms throughout the chaos of the sub-Roman period. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged in the wake of Roman withdrawal brought with them very different cultural attitudes towards sexuality and prostitution, shaped by Germanic tribal customs and, increasingly, by Christian moral teachings that would fundamentally transform the legal and social landscape of sexual commerce. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon England to Christianity, beginning with the arrival of Augustine's mission in Kent in 597 AD, and continuing over the next century as various kingdoms accepted the new faith, introduced moral and legal frameworks that would shape English attitudes toward prostitution for over a millennium. The Christian Church's teachings on sexuality emphasized chastity, condemned fornication, and viewed the human body as a temple that should not be defiled by lustful acts, creating an ideological foundation for the prohibition of prostitution that nevertheless coexisted with the practical reality that sexual commerce continued to exist in various forms throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The legal codes promulgated by Anglo-Saxon kings reflected this Christian influence, while also maintaining elements of earlier Germanic customary law, creating a complex regulatory environment where prostitution was officially disapproved, but not entirely prohibited. The laws of King Ine of Wessex, dating to the late 7th century, mentioned penalties for fornication and established fines for sexual misconduct, though they did not explicitly address commercial prostitution as a distinct category of offence. The laws of King Alfred, compiled around 890 AD, similarly addressed sexual morality within the broader context of Christian teaching, prescribing penances and fines for various sexual transgressions, while acknowledging that enforcement of these moral standards remained inconsistent and varied considerably across different regions and social classes. The Anglo-Saxon Church attempted to regulate sexual behavior through the penitential system, which assigned specific penances for different sins, with fornication typically requiring periods of fasting, prayer, and abstention from communion. The penitentials, handbooks used by priests to assign appropriate penances for confessed sins, included detailed schedules of punishment for various sexual acts, distinguishing between fornication with prostitutes, adultery, and other forms of sexual misconduct, with the severity of penance depending on factors including the frequency of the sin, the social status of the individuals involved, and whether the act had been committed openly or secretly. Despite the Church's official condemnation of prostitution, the practice continued throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, particularly in urban settlements and trading centres, where concentrations of men with disposable income created demand for sexual services. The evidence for Anglo-Saxon prostitution comes primarily from legal codes, ecclesiastical documents, and occasional references in chronicles and literary works, as the physical archaeological evidence for brothels from this period remains scarce due to the predominance of wooden construction that has not survived in the archaeological record. The terminology used in Anglo-Saxon texts to describe prostitutes and prostitution included words like port-sea damen, literally meaning port woman, suggesting the association of prostitution with trading settlements and coastal towns where ships arrived with sailors seeking entertainment. The social status of prostitutes in Anglo-Saxon England appears to have been extremely low, with women engaged in sex work occupying a marginal position in society, vulnerable to violence and exploitation, and with few legal protections available to them. The sources suggest that many women entered prostitution due to economic desperation, having lost family support through widowhood, abandonment, or social ostracism, and finding few alternative means of survival in a society that offered limited economic opportunities for women outside marriage or religious life. The regulation of prostitution in Anglo-Saxon England appears to have been primarily a local matter, with individual communities and lords establishing their own rules regarding acceptable sexual behavior and the consequences for violations. Some evidence suggests that certain Anglo-Saxon towns may have had designated areas where prostitutes operated, though this remains difficult to confirm from the available sources. The Viking incursions and eventual settlement of large portions of England during the 9th and 10th centuries introduced additional cultural influences on attitudes towards sexuality and prostitution, as Scandinavian customs regarding sexual behavior differed in various ways from both Anglo-Saxon and Christian norms. The Viking presence in England, particularly in the Danelaw territories, created cosmopolitan urban centres like Jorvik, York, where diverse populations mingled and where the demand for commercial sexual services likely increased due to the presence of merchants, craftsmen, and warriors from multiple cultural backgrounds. The gradual process of Christianization of the Viking settlers brought them increasingly under the influence of church teachings on sexual morality, though Scandinavian attitudes towards sexuality remained somewhat more pragmatic than the ideals promoted by Christian clergy. The reunification of England under the West Saxon dynasty in the 10th century and the subsequent monastic reform movement, led by figures like Dunstan, brought renewed emphasis on Christian moral standards and attempts to regulate sexual behavior more strictly. The development of royal law codes during the late Anglo-Saxon period, particularly under Kings Edgar, Ethelred, and Sinead, included increasingly detailed provisions regarding sexual morality and the punishment of fornication, adultery, and other sexual transgressions. The laws of Canute, promulgated in the early 11th century, explicitly commanded that prostitutes be driven from the land and that Christians should maintain chastity, reflecting the continuing tension between Christian moral ideals and the practical persistence of commercial prostitution. The enforcement of these moral regulations remained highly variable, depending on the zeal of local authorities, the influence of the church in particular regions, and the practical difficulties of monitoring and controlling private sexual behavior. The conquest of England by William of Normandy in 1066 brought significant changes to English legal, social, and administrative systems, though the impact on prostitution and its regulation was gradual rather than immediate, as Norman conquerors confronted the same tensions between Christian moral teachings and human sexual behavior that had characterized the Anglo-Saxon period. The Norman conquest initiated a transformation of English society that would ultimately create the conditions for more organized and regulated systems of prostitution. Though this development occurred gradually over the century and a half following 1066, as urbanization accelerated, the money economy expanded, and new forms of lordship and urban governance emerged. The Normans brought with them continental European approaches to law and administration, including more systematic methods of extracting revenue from all aspects of economic activity, which would eventually extend to the licensing and taxation of brothels in certain jurisdictions. The initial decades following the conquest saw relatively little change in how prostitution was practiced or regulated, as the Norman elite focused on consolidating their control over English lands and establishing new political structures, while the Church continued its long-standing condemnation of sexual immorality without achieving any notable success in eliminating prostitution. The growth of London under Norman and early Plantagenet rule created increasingly favourable conditions for commercial prostitution. As the city's population expanded, its role as a centre of trade and administration intensified, and growing numbers of men with disposable income sought entertainment in urban environments that offered anonymity and opportunity. The establishment of Westminster as the seat of royal government, separate from but closely connected to the commercial city of London, created a concentration of clerks, officials, lawyers, and others whose work brought them to the capital for extended periods, providing a steady clientele for prostitutes and brothels. The development of Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames directly across from the City of London, as a centre for entertainment, vice, and activities prohibited or restricted within the city proper, marked a crucial development in the geography of English prostitution that would persist for centuries. Southwark's location outside the immediate jurisdiction of London's authorities, while remaining easily accessible to city residents and visitors, made it an ideal location for activities that occupied an ambiguous legal status, including brothels, gambling establishments, theatres, and bear-baiting arenas. The bishops of Winchester, who held lordship over a large portion of Southwark, including the district known as the Liberty of the Clink, made a decision during the 12th century that would profoundly shape the history of English prostitution by choosing to license and regulate brothels in their jurisdiction rather than attempting to suppress them entirely. This pragmatic approach, which recognized that prostitution would continue regardless of official prohibition, and therefore should be controlled and taxed to minimize its negative effects while generating revenue, represented a significant development in the English regulation of sexual commerce. The ordinances established by the bishops of Winchester for the governance of brothels in Southwark, dating from approximately 1161 during the episcopate of Henry of Blois, represent the first detailed English regulations specifically addressing the operation of commercial sex establishments. These regulations, later codified and expanded in documents known as the Ordinances for the Government of the Stewhouses on the Bankside, established rules governing virtually every aspect of brothel operation, including licensing requirements, restrictions on who could own or work in establishments, provisions intended to protect workers from certain forms of exploitation, and penalties for violations of the established rules. The terminology used in these regulations referred to brothels as stewhouses or stews, terms derived from the public bathhouses that had existed since Roman times, and that often served as fronts for prostitution, with private bathing rooms providing convenient venues for sexual encounters. The bishop's regulations prohibited brothel keepers from holding women against their will, from extending credit to prostitutes that would trap them in debt, bondage, and from operating their establishments on holy days, when Christian prohibitions on sexual activity were supposed to apply with particular force. These rules, while ostensibly protective of prostitutes, also served to maintain order and prevent the most egregious abuses that might provoke public outcry or moral intervention from church authorities. Less willing to tolerate regulated prostitution, the licensing fees and fines collected from Southwark brothels generated substantial revenue for the bishops of Winchester, creating a financial incentive to maintain the system while simultaneously placing the church in the morally awkward position of profiting from sexual sin. The concentration of licensed brothels in Southwark created what would later be called the red light district, though the term itself would not emerge until centuries later, where sexual services were openly available in establishments that operated under official sanction. The physical appearance of Southwark brothels during the medieval period varied considerably, with some establishments occupying substantial buildings with multiple rooms, gardens, and facilities for bathing and entertainment, while others consisted of little more than crude wooden structures with basic amenities. The larger, more prosperous brothels catered to wealthy clients, offering not only sexual services, but also food, drink, music, and gambling in environments designed to appeal to men seeking sophisticated entertainment. The women working in these establishments came from diverse backgrounds, though the majority appear to have entered prostitution due to economic necessity, having lost respectable means of support through widowhood, family abandonment, or personal misfortune. Some women entered prostitution voluntarily, seeing it as preferable to other available options, such as heavy manual labor or domestic service, though the extent to which any choice made under conditions of limited alternatives can be considered truly voluntary remains debatable. The working conditions in medieval Southwark brothels were harsh by modern standards, with women typically required to serve multiple clients daily, often in quick succession, with minimal privacy and little concern for their comfort or dignity. The health risks associated with prostitution were severe, including sexually transmitted diseases for which no effective treatments existed, unwanted pregnancies that could prove life-threatening, and violence from clients, brothel keepers, or others who viewed prostitutes as appropriate targets for abuse. Medieval medical understanding of sexual health was limited and often counterproductive, with treatments for venereal diseases, including mercury applications, bloodletting, and various herbal remedies that were at best ineffective and sometimes actively harmful. The social stigma attached to prostitution remained intense throughout the medieval period, with prostitutes occupying the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy, excluded from respectable society, barred from churches during services, and required in some places to wear distinctive clothing or badges that marked their status. The legislation regarding prostitutes' clothing varied across different English towns, with some requiring prostitutes to wear striped hoods, specific colours, or other markers that would identify them in public spaces, ensuring that respectable women would not be confused with sex workers, and that men could readily identify women available for hire. These clothing regulations paralleled similar requirements in continental European cities, where distinctive dress for prostitutes was standard practice by the 13th century, reflecting the broader medieval concern with maintaining clear visual distinctions between social classes and moral categories. The expansion of prostitution beyond Southwark occurred throughout medieval England, with brothels and individual prostitutes operating in virtually every substantial town, though most lacked the formal regulatory framework that characterized the Winchester liberty. Norwich, Bristol, Southampton, York, and other significant urban centres all had prostitution districts, though the evidence for their organisation and regulation remains more fragmentary than for London and Southwark. Some English towns attempted to prohibit prostitution entirely, passing ordinances that banned brothels and prescribed penalties for prostitutes and their clients, though enforcement of these prohibitions was typically inconsistent and ineffective. with authorities often tolerating prostitution in practice while maintaining its official illegality. The relationship between medieval prostitution and the Church remained complex and contradictory throughout the period, with Church authorities simultaneously condemning sexual sin while sometimes profiting from the regulation of brothels, as in the case of the bishops of Winchester. The theological framework for understanding prostitution, derived from Augustine and other Church fathers, held that while sexual sin was morally wrong, prostitution served the social function of providing an outlet for male sexual desires that might otherwise lead to worse evils, such as adultery or rape of respectable women. This view, encapsulated in Augustine's metaphor comparing prostitutes to sewers in a palace, acknowledged that while sewers were filthy and undesirable, they served the essential function of carrying away waste that would otherwise contaminate the entire structure. The medieval Church's approach to prostitution thus combined moral condemnation with pragmatic toleration, maintaining that the practice was sinful but recognizing that it would continue and that efforts should focus on minimizing harm rather than achieving impossible elimination. The lives of medieval prostitutes occasionally became visible in historical records through legal proceedings, wills, property transactions, and other documents that preserve fragments of information about these marginalized women. Court records reveal cases of prostitutes accused of theft from clients, of disputes between prostitutes and brothel keepers over payment, and of violence against sex workers, providing glimpses into the daily realities and dangers of medieval prostitution. The few testamentary records left by prostitutes show that some managed to accumulate modest property despite the stigma and exploitation they faced, with occasional wills documenting small bequests to churches or charitable institutions, suggesting that even women who worked as prostitutes maintained religious beliefs and hoped for salvation. The gradual changes in English urban society during the later Middle Ages, including the growth of craft guilds, the development of more complex local government structures, and the increasing differentiation of urban spaces into distinct districts with particular characters and functions, all influence the geography and organization of prostitution. The development of permanent red light districts in English towns, where prostitution was effectively tolerated, if not officially sanctioned, reflected broader patterns of urban zoning that separated different types of economic activities and concentrated potentially disruptive or morally questionable enterprises in specific areas where they could be monitored and controlled. The outbreak of the Black Death in 1348 and subsequent plague recurrences during the later 14th century profoundly disrupted English society, killing perhaps half the population and creating severe labor shortages that transformed economic relationships and social hierarchies. The impact of plague on prostitution was complex, with initial disruption as urban populations shrank and economic activity contracted, followed by recovery as survivors found themselves with greater economic opportunities and more disposable income. The labor shortages following the plague enabled surviving workers, including women, to demand higher wages and better conditions, though the extent to which this applied to prostitutes remains unclear from available evidence. The 15th century saw continued operation of Southwark's brothels under the regulation of the bishops of Winchester, with periodic attempts at reform or tightened regulation generally proving temporary and ineffective against the economic incentives that sustained the sex trade. The civic authorities of London periodically expressed concern about prostitution, particularly about prostitutes operating within the city boundaries rather than in Southwark, and passed ordinances attempting to control the movement and visibility of sex workers in public spaces. The Tudor period, spanning from Henry Tudor's accession as Henry VII in 1485 through the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, witnessed dramatic transformations in English religious, social, and political life that profoundly affected the regulation and practice of prostitution. The early Tudor period initially saw continuity with late medieval patterns, including the ongoing operation of Southwark's licensed brothels under the jurisdiction of the bishops of Winchester, though tensions regarding the Church's role in profiting from vice were becoming increasingly uncomfortable as reform movements gained strength. The religious upheavals initiated by Henry VIII's break with Rome beginning in the 1530s, created a new context for thinking about sexual morality and the regulation of prostitution, as Protestant reformers brought intensified focus to issues of personal morality and condemned the perceived hypocrisy of Catholic clergy profiting from sinful activities. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, which saw the crown seize control of enormous monastic properties and wealth, included the transfer of various peculiar jurisdictions that had been held by ecclesiastical authorities, including eventually the Winchester Liberty in Southwark. The changes in Southwark's administration during the 1530s and 1540s created uncertainty about the continued legality of the brothels that had operated under episcopal license for nearly 4 centuries, with reformers arguing that the new Protestant church could not be seen to profit from prostitution in the way that corrupt Catholic bishops had done. In 1546, Henry VIII issued a proclamation ordering the closure of the Southwark brothels, commanding that the stew houses be shut down and that prostitutes be expelled from the area, marking the formal end of licensed prostitution in England and initiating a new phase of prohibition that would ostensibly last for centuries. The 1546 proclamation reflected both Protestant moral reform impulses and practical concerns about venereal disease, which was spreading rapidly through English towns during the early Tudor period, with syphilis having arrived in England by around 1500 and causing considerable alarm among medical practitioners and civic authorities. The actual impact of the 1546 closure order was less dramatic than might be expected, as prostitution in Southwark continued despite official prohibition, with sex workers and brothel keepers simply operating illegally rather than under the previous system of licenses and regulation. The transition from regulated to prohibited prostitution created new vulnerabilities for sex workers, who lost whatever minimal protections the old system had provided and became subject to arrest and punishment by authorities who no longer had financial incentives to tolerate their activities. The enforcement of anti-prostitution measures during the Tudor period varied considerably over time and between different jurisdictions, with periods of zealous crackdown alternating with periods of relative tolerance, depending on the priorities of local authorities and the broader political and religious climate. The reigns of Edward VI and Mary I saw continued official condemnation of prostitution, though practical enforcement remained inconsistent and ineffective at eliminating the sex trade from English towns. The Elizabethan period, encompassing the long reign of Elizabeth I from 1558 to 1603, saw the consolidation of Protestant moral reforms, while also witnessing a flowering of urban entertainment culture that created new contexts for prostitution and sexual commerce. The growth of London during the Elizabethan period, with the population expanding from perhaps 75,000 in 1550 to over 200,000 by 1600, created unprecedented concentrations of men seeking entertainment and sexual services in the capital. The development of the London theatre district, with permanent playhouses established in Suffolk and other suburban areas outside the direct control of city authorities, created entertainment zones that attracted crowds and fostered an atmosphere where prostitutes could solicit clients. The association between theatres and prostitution was strong enough that Puritan critics of the stage regularly cited the presence of prostitutes in playhouses as evidence of the theatre's corrupting influence on public morality. Prostitutes working in Elizabethan London included both streetwalkers who solicited in public spaces and women who operated from lodgings in particular neighbourhoods known for vice, with contemporary accounts describing certain streets and districts where prostitutes could be reliably found. The taverns and alley-houses of Elizabethan London often served as venues where prostitutes met clients, with some establishments actively facilitating prostitution, while others merely tolerated the presence of sex workers who frequented their premises. The regulation of taverns and alley-houses included provisions intended to prevent them from becoming brothels, with licensing authorities instructed to revoke the licenses of publicans who harboured prostitutes or allowed their establishments to be used for immoral purposes. The enforcement of these regulations was sporadic and often ineffective, as the financial incentives for publicans to tolerate or encourage prostitution were substantial, while the penalties for violations were often light enough to be considered simply a cost of doing business. The system of criminal justice in Tudor England included various mechanisms for punishing prostitutes and those who facilitated prostitution, including presentment by local constables, trial before justices of the peace, and punishment through fines, public shaming, whipping, or imprisonment. The practice of public shaming for sexual offences, including parading convicted prostitutes through the streets or subjecting them to the pillory or stocks, reflected the Tudor emphasis on using public humiliation as a mechanism of social control and moral enforcement. The carting of prostitutes, a punishment where convicted sex workers were placed in open carts and driven through the streets while being subjected to public mockery and sometimes physical abuse, became a regular spectacle in Tudor London and other English towns. The branding of convicted prostitutes, marking their faces or bodies with hot irons to permanently identify them as having engaged in sexual sin, represented one of the harshest punishments available to Tudor authorities, creating permanent visible stigma that would follow women for the rest of their lives. The Tudor Poor Laws, particularly the comprehensive legislation enacted during Elizabeth's reign, established new frameworks for managing poverty and vagrancy that affected prostitutes, who were often categorized as vagrants or idle persons subject to punishment and forced labor. The Elizabethan Vagrancy Act of 1598 included provisions targeting prostitutes as a category of masterless persons who lived by immoral means and should be whipped and sent back to their parishes of origin, reflecting the broader Tudor anxiety about mobile populations and the breakdown of traditional social controls. The economics of prostitution during the Tudor period reflected both the expansion of the money economy and the severe economic pressures facing women who lacked family support or other means of subsistence. The testimony preserved in court records and contemporary accounts suggests that many women entered prostitution temporarily during periods of economic distress, engaging in sex work to survive until other opportunities became available, while others became more permanently involved in the trade. The prices charged for sexual services during the Tudor period varied considerably, depending on the status and appearance of the prostitute, the location and circumstances of the encounter, and the nature of the services provided, with contemporary sources suggesting that basic sexual transactions might cost anywhere from a few pence to several shillings. The hierarchy of prostitution that existed in Elizabethan London ranged from common streetwalkers who serviced poor men for pennies to high-class courtesans who maintained wealthy patrons and lived in relative comfort, with the latter occupying an ambiguous position in society where their activities were known but tolerated due to their discretion and their connections to powerful men. The 16th century also saw the emergence of organized criminal networks involved in prostitution, with some entrepreneurs running multiple houses of prostitution or controlling the activities of numerous sex workers, taking a portion of their earnings in exchange for providing lodging, protection, and access to clients. The phenomenon of the board, typically an older woman who recruited younger women into prostitution, arranged encounters between prostitutes and clients, and sometimes provided lodging or other services, became a recognizable figure in Tudor urban life, appearing frequently in contemporary literature, plays, and moral tracts. The literary representation of prostitutes and bawds in Tudor drama and popular literature provides considerable evidence for contemporary attitudes toward prostitution, with playwrights like Shakespeare, Dekker, and Middleton creating numerous characters drawn from London's underworld of sex workers, pimps, and their clients. The medical understanding of venereal disease during the Tudor period remained limited, with physicians recognizing that syphilis and other conditions were transmitted through sexual contact, but possessing no effective treatments for these infections. The establishment of lock hospitals for the treatment of venereal disease, beginning with the Suffolk Lock Hospital, founded in the 1530s, represented early attempts to manage the public health consequences of prostitution, though the treatments available were largely ineffective and sometimes worse than the diseases themselves. The Tudor period thus established patterns that would characterize English prostitution for centuries to come, including the formal prohibition of brothels, combined with their continued operation in practice, the concentration of prostitution, in particular urban districts, the association of sex work with entertainment venues, and the targeting of prostitutes themselves for punishment, while their clients largely escaped legal consequences. The Stuart period, beginning with James I's succession in 1603 and continuing through the reigns of Charles I, the interregnum, Charles II, James II, and concluding with the joint reign of William and Mary and the rule of Anne, witnessed profound political upheavals that affected every aspect of English life, including the practice and regulation of prostitution. The early Stuart period under James I saw continuity with late Elizabethan patterns of prostitution, with London continuing to grow rapidly and its suburbs becoming increasingly associated with vice and entertainment that civic authorities struggled to control. The Jacobean theatre district, which included famous playhouses like the Globe, the Swan, and the Hope, remained closely associated with prostitution, with contemporary accounts describing how prostitutes frequented theatres to solicit clients from among the audiences that gathered for performances. The publication of satirical and moral literature during the Jacobean period provides extensive evidence regarding contemporary prostitution, with writers like Thomas Dekker producing detailed descriptions of London's underworld that included vivid portraits of prostitutes, bawds, and the various tricks and schemes by which they separated foolish men from their money. The reign of Charles I, from 1625 until his execution in 1649, saw increasing Puritan influence in London and other urban areas, with moral reformers pushing for stricter enforcement of laws against vice and immorality, though their success remained limited as long as the royal court maintained its relatively relaxed attitude towards sexual behaviour. The political and religious conflicts that led to the English Civil War created chaos that initially disrupted normal patterns of urban life, including prostitution, though the sex trade proved remarkably resilient and adapted quickly to changed circumstances. The interregnum period, during which England was governed as a commonwealth and then protectorate under Oliver Cromwell from 1649 to 1658, brought the most determined effort to suppress prostitution and enforce godly behaviour that England had yet experienced. The Puritan authorities who controlled London during the 1650s implemented strict moral regulations, including laws that made adultery punishable by death, though this extreme penalty was rarely carried out in practice, and enhanced punishments for prostitution and brothel keeping. The major generals, military officials who governed England's regions during 1655 and 1656, received instructions to suppress vice and immorality in their jurisdictions, leading to intensified campaigns against prostitutes, brothels, and other manifestations of sexual sin. The closure of theatres during the interregnum eliminated one venue where prostitutes had traditionally solicited clients, though this likely simply displaced the activity to other locations, rather than reducing prostitution overall. The evidence suggests that prostitution continued throughout the interregnum, despite the harsh penalties and determined enforcement efforts, with women continuing to sell sexual services and men continuing to purchase them, though practitioners exercised greater discretion to avoid detection by the godly authorities. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought a dramatic reversal in moral climate, with the new king and his court modelling behaviour that celebrated sexual license, theatrical entertainment, and conspicuous consumption that scandalised Puritan critics, but influenced social attitudes throughout the realm. The reopening of theatres, after the Restoration, now for the first time permitting women to perform as actresses, rather than having female roles played by boys, created new forms of entertainment and new connections between performance and prostitution, as some actresses supplemented their incomes through prostitution or maintained wealthy lovers who supported them financially. The figure of the mistress, a woman maintained in comfortable circumstances by a wealthy protector in exchange for sexual exclusivity, became more visible and socially acceptable during the Restoration, with the king himself openly maintaining multiple mistresses who played prominent roles at court. The most famous of Charles's mistresses, including Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, and Louise de Querouaille, occupied positions of considerable influence and wealth, demonstrating that women who would have been condemned as prostitutes in less permissive contexts could achieve social prominence when they enjoyed royal favour. The Restoration period saw the flourishing of the London sex trade, with prostitutes working from lodgings, taverns, theatres, and the streets, serving a clientele that ranged from apprentices and sailors to wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and occasionally members of the royal family. The development of the West End of London as a fashionable residential area for the wealthy created new geography for high-class prostitution, with expensive courtesans establishing themselves in neighbourhoods where they could attract wealthy clients while maintaining some degree of respectability. The publication of pamphlets, broadsides, and books describing London prostitution became a minor literary industry during the Restoration, with works purporting to list the names, addresses, and specialties of prostitutes circulating despite periodic government attempts to suppress such publications. The most notorious of these publications, a pamphlet called The Wandering Whore, appeared in multiple editions during the 1650s and described the supposed locations and activities of numerous London prostitutes, serving simultaneously as titillation for readers and as a kind of consumer guide for prospective clients. The commercialization of information about prostitution through printed guides represented an early form of advertising that made the sex trade more visible and accessible, while also exposing prostitutes to greater public scrutiny, moral condemnation. The development of the Molly House during the late 17th century, establishments where men who desired sexual encounters with other men could meet relatively safely, represented a distinct subculture of sexual commerce that operated alongside and sometimes overlapped with heterosexual prostitution. The regulation of prostitution during the Restoration and late Stuart period remained officially strict, with laws on the books that prescribed harsh punishments for prostitutes and brothel keepers, though enforcement was inconsistent and often failed to suppress the sex trade in practice. The Societies for the Reformation of Manners, voluntary organizations that emerged during the 1690s in response to the perceived moral decay of English society, initiated campaigns to identify and prosecute prostitutes, brothel keepers, and their clients, achieving considerable success in bringing cases before magistrates during the final years of the 17th century. These moral reform societies, composed primarily of middle-class tradesmen and professionals, motivated by religious conviction and concern for social order, employed agents to gather evidence against persons engaged in vice and paid legal costs for the prosecution of offenders, creating a private enforcement mechanism that supplemented the inadequate efforts of official authorities. The Societies for the Reformation of Manners succeeded in obtaining thousands of convictions for prostitution and related offences during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, though their impact on the actual prevalence of prostitution was limited, as the punishments imposed were generally mild, and women released after brief imprisonment or payment of fines typically returned to sex work immediately. The lives of prostitutes during the Stuart period remained harsh and dangerous, with women facing constant risks of disease, violence, unwanted pregnancy, and arrest, while also suffering from the social stigma that marked them as outcasts from respectable society. The economic motivations driving women into prostitution during this period included the limited options available to women lacking family support, education, or inherited property, with domestic service, needlework, and street vending offering the main alternatives to prostitution for poor women, and these occupations typically provided subsistence wages insufficient to support independent living. The phenomenon of part-time prostitution, where women supplemented meagre wages from legitimate employment with occasional sex work during periods of particular hardship, appears to have been common throughout the Stuart period, complicating any simple distinction between respectable poor women and prostitutes. The relationship between poverty and prostitution was well understood by contemporary observers, with moralists and reformers recognizing that economic desperation drove many women into the sex trade, though this understanding generally did not lead to systematic efforts to address the underlying economic inequalities that created conditions where prostitution represented a rational survival strategy for impoverished women. The health consequences of prostitution during the Stuart period were severe and often fatal, with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted infections endemic among sex workers and spreading through the broader population via the clients who moved between prostitutes and respectable relationships. The medical treatments available for venereal disease during the 17th century included mercury applications, which were toxic and caused severe side effects, bleeding and purging, which weakened patients without addressing the underlying infections, and various herbal remedies of dubious efficacy. The stigma associated with venereal disease meant that many sufferers delayed seeking treatment or concealed their conditions, allowing infections to progress to advanced stages that caused severe disability or death. The lock hospitals that provided treatment specifically for venereal disease operated on a charity basis, offering care to patients who could not afford private physicians, though the quality of treatment remained poor by modern standards, and many patients died or suffered permanent damage from both disease and treatment. The final decades of the Stuart period, during the reigns of William and Mary and Queen Anne, saw continued growth of London and other English towns, creating expanding markets for prostitution, while also generating increasing concern among reformers about the moral health of English society. The Georgian period, spanning from the accession of George I in 1714 through the death of George IV in 1830, witnessed unprecedented urbanization and social change that profoundly shaped the practice and perception of prostitution in England. The expansion of London during the 18th century created a metropolis of extraordinary size and complexity, with the population growing from approximately 600,000 in 1700 to nearly 1 million by 1800, making it Europe's largest city and creating vast demand for commercial sexual services. The geography of London prostitution during the Georgian period encompassed multiple distinct markets, serving different clienteles, with elegant courtesans entertaining wealthy men in fashionable West End neighbourhoods, brothels of various qualities operating in districts like Covent Garden and St James, and street prostitutes soliciting in less respectable areas like the docks and back alleys. The development of Covent Garden as London's primary red light district during the early 18th century reflected the area's transitional character. Initially developed as a fashionable residential square during the 17th century, but gradually declining in status as wealthy residents moved westward, leaving behind a district of lodging houses, taverns, theatres, and coffee houses that became ideal venues for prostitution. The piazza at Covent Garden, with its covered arcades and proximity to the Theatre Royal, became notorious as a gathering place for prostitutes of all classes, from elegant women in fashionable dress to desperate streetwalkers selling services for pennies. The publication of Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, an annual directory of prostitutes that appeared each year from 1764 to 1793, provided detailed descriptions of individual sex workers, including their physical appearance, specialties, personalities, and addresses, creating what was essentially a consumer guide to London prostitution. Harris's List entries combined titillating descriptions with practical information, adopting a tone that was simultaneously humorous and exploitative, treating prostitutes as commodities to be evaluated and consumed by discriminating gentlemen. The publication of such guides, while officially illegal, operated openly enough that editions could be purchased at print shops and bookstalls, suggesting that authorities tolerated this form of commercial sexual advertising, despite its obvious contradiction with laws prohibiting prostitution. The economics of prostitution during the Georgian period reflected the broader patterns of wealth distribution in English society, with a small number of elite courtesans accumulating considerable fortunes through relationships with wealthy protectors, while the majority of sex workers earned precarious subsistence incomes from streetwalking or work in cheap brothels. The most successful courtesans of the Georgian period, women like Kitty Fisher, who was painted by Joshua Reynolds and mentioned in nursery rhymes, or Harriet Wilson, whose memoirs published in 1825 caused a scandal by naming her aristocratic clients, achieved a form of celebrity that blurred the boundaries between prostitution and society entertainment. These elite sex workers maintained elegant establishments, employed servants, dressed in the latest fashions, and socialized with men of rank and fortune in contexts that resembled marriage or conventional courtship more than commercial prostitution as practiced by poorer women. The memoirs written by or attributed to famous courtesans during the late Georgian period provide valuable evidence regarding the lives and perspectives of high-class prostitutes, though these accounts were often heavily edited or entirely ghostwritten to appeal to readers seeking scandalous revelations about aristocratic sexual behavior. The vast majority of Georgian prostitutes lived far less glamorous lives than the famous courtesans, whose stories circulated in memoirs and gossip, working from squalid lodgings in slum districts, serving multiple clients daily for small payments, and facing constant threats of violence, disease, and starvation. The system of brothel organization during the Georgian period typically involved a madam, usually an older woman, often a former prostitute herself, who rented or owned premises and employed younger women to service clients, taking a substantial portion of their earnings in exchange for providing lodging, meals, clothing, and protection. The relationship between madams and the women who worked for them was often exploitative, with prostitutes charged inflated prices for room and board and forbidden from leaving until debts were paid, creating a form of debt bondage that trapped women in prostitution even when they wished to escape. The recruitment of women into prostitution during the 18th century involved various methods, from outright abduction and coercion to more subtle manipulation of vulnerable young women newly arrived in London from the countryside. The figure of the procuress, a woman who identified and recruited potential prostitutes through various means, including offering employment in legitimate trades that turned out to be facades for brothels, became a stock character in Georgian literature and a genuine threat to young women navigating the dangerous environment of 18th century London. The linkage between domestic service and prostitution was particularly strong during this period, with servants dismissed without references for sexual indiscretions, pregnancy, or theft, finding prostitution to be one of few available options for survival in an economy that offered limited opportunities for women lacking good character references. The development of Magdalene hospitals for penitent prostitutes, charitable institutions designed to rescue women from the sex trade and train them for honest employment, represented humanitarian efforts to address prostitution by providing alternatives. Though these institutions could accommodate only a tiny fraction of the women engaged in sex work and impose strict moral and religious requirements that many prostitutes found intolerable. The first Magdalene Hospital, opened in London in 1758, offered shelter, religious instruction, and training in needlework to prostitutes who genuinely repented their immoral lives and committed to reform, though the institution's paternalistic approach and its emphasis on the fallen woman's sinfulness created an environment that many found oppressive. The Foundling Hospital, established by Thomas Coram in 1741 to care for abandoned infants, was closely connected to the prostitution problem, as many of the children admitted had been born to prostitutes who could not care for them, creating a grim pipeline from illegitimate birth through institutional care to potential futures that often included prostitution for girls and crime for boys. The legal regulation of prostitution during the Georgian period operated through a combination of common law principles, local statutes, and summary jurisdiction exercised by magistrates, creating a complex and often inconsistent system of enforcement. Prostitutes could be prosecuted as vagrants, as common nightwalkers, as keepers of disorderly houses if they operated from fixed locations, or under various local statutes that prohibited specific behaviors associated with sex work. The practical enforcement of anti-prostitution laws fell primarily to local constables and watchmen, many of whom supplemented their modest official incomes by accepting bribes from prostitutes and brothel keepers to ignore their activities, creating a system of informal licensing through corruption. The trading justices, magistrates who exploited their positions for personal profit by extracting fees and bribes from those brought before them, represented another source of corruption in the system, with some magistrates known to arrest prostitutes primarily to collect fines and fees rather than to suppress vice. The most notorious of these corrupt magistrates, figures like Thomas de Vale and his successor Henry Fielding, who served as Westminster magistrates during the mid-18th century, attempted to reform the system while acknowledging the practical impossibility of eliminating prostitution through law enforcement alone. The Fielding brothers, Henry and John, who successively served as magistrates at Bow Street, established the Bow Street Runners, an early form of professional police force, and attempted to implement more systematic approaches to managing crime, including prostitution, though their resources remained inadequate to the scale of the problems they confronted. The social geography of Georgian London created distinct territories associated with different types of prostitution, with genteel areas like St. James and Mayfair hosting elegant brothels serving aristocratic clients, Covent Garden providing a middle market for professional men and prosperous tradesmen, and squalid districts like Seven Dials and Spitalfields, containing the desperate street prostitution of the very poor. The Fleet Street and Strand areas, with their proximity to the Inns of Court where lawyers trained and worked, became notorious for prostitutes, catering to legal professionals and their clients, creating an association between the law and vice that contemporary satirists found endlessly amusing. The theatrical districts, particularly around Drury Lane and Covent Garden, maintained strong associations with prostitution throughout the Georgian period, with actresses frequently presumed to be sexually available and theatres serving as venues where prostitutes solicited clients among the audiences. The masquerades and pleasure gardens that provided entertainment for Georgian Londoners created additional venues where prostitutes could meet potential clients in settings that allowed for anonymity and sexual license. Vauxhall Gardens, Ranelagh, and other commercial pleasure gardens featured illuminated walks, private supper boxes, and masked balls where social boundaries could be transgressed and women of ambiguous respectability mingled with genuine aristocrats and wealthy merchants. The health risks associated with prostitution during the Georgian period remained severe, with venereal disease endemic among sex workers and spreading through the broader population via clients who carried infections home to wives or passed them to other prostitutes. The Lock Hospital, which had been refounded in 1746 specifically to treat patients with venereal disease, provided care to thousands of patients during the Georgian period, though its capacity remained inadequate to the scale of the problem. The medical understanding of venereal disease improved somewhat during the 18th century, with physicians distinguishing between syphilis and gonorrhea as separate conditions and developing marginally better treatments, though mercury remained the primary remedy for syphilis despite its severe toxicity. The public health implications of prostitution received increasing attention from medical and social reformers during the late Georgian period, with physicians publishing treatises on venereal disease that combined medical information with moral exhortation against sexual license. The artistic representation of prostitution during the Georgian period reflected contemporary attitudes that combined moral condemnation with voyeuristic fascination, creating images that both criticized and commodified sex workers. William Hogarth's famous print series, A Harlot's Progress, published in 1732, depicted the decline and fall of a country girl seduced into prostitution in London, showing her progression from kept mistress to street prostitute to diseased prisoner to corpse, creating a moral narrative that warned against vice, while providing viewers with titillating images of prostitution's various stages. The popularity of Hogarth's prints and the numerous imitations they inspired demonstrated the commercial potential of artistic representations of prostitution, with publishers discovering that images of attractive women in various stages of undress sold well, regardless of the ostensible moral message attached to them. The literature of the Georgian period engaged extensively with prostitution. From John Cleland's Fanny Hill, the infamous erotic novel published in 1748 that presented prostitution in relatively positive terms, to Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, which portrayed seduction and sexual ruin as tragic catastrophes, to Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, which treated prostitution with more complexity and compassion than most contemporary works. The final decades of the Georgian period, during the Regency era and the reign of George IV, saw the emergence of new forms of moral reform advocacy that would eventually lead to major changes in how prostitution was regulated and understood in English society. The Victorian period, encompassing the long reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, witnessed transformations in the scale, visibility, and regulation of prostitution that reflected broader changes in English society. including rapid urbanization, industrialization, the expansion of empire, and the development of new middle-class moral ideologies. The dramatic growth of English cities during the 19th century created unprecedented concentrations of population, with London expanding from approximately 1.4 million inhabitants in 1831 to 6.6 million by 1901, while industrial cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Leeds also grew exponentially, creating urban environments where prostitution flourished on a scale that alarmed contemporary observers. The estimate by social reformers during the mid-Victorian period that London alone contained between 50,000 and 80,000 prostitutes reflected both genuine concern about the scale of the sex trade and the methodological difficulties of counting women engaged in an activity that was illegal, stigmatized, and often temporary or part-time. The attempts to quantify prostitution during the Victorian period revealed the complexities of defining who qualified as a prostitute, as many women engaged occasionally in sex work while maintaining other employment, while others had relationships with men that provided financial support in exchange for sexual access, but did not clearly constitute prostitution in its commercial form. The social investigation of prostitution during the Victorian period produced numerous books, articles, and reports that documented the conditions of sex workers and debated the causes and cures of prostitution, with researchers like Henry Mayhew, William Acton, and William Stead producing detailed accounts based on interviews, observations, and statistical analysis. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, published between 1849 and 1850, included extensive sections on prostitution based on interviews with sex workers that provided rare first-hand accounts of their experiences, motivations, and living conditions. William Acton's Prostitution Considered in its Moral, Social, and Sanitary Aspects, published in 1857 with a second edition in 1870, represented the most comprehensive Victorian medical study of prostitution, though Acton's conclusions reflected moral assumptions as much as scientific evidence. The geographical concentration of prostitution in Victorian London centred on several distinct districts, including the Haymarket, which became synonymous with high-class prostitution and attracted elegant sex workers who promenaded in fashionable dress to attract wealthy clients, and the East End, where desperate poverty drove thousands of women into street prostitution under conditions of extreme exploitation and danger. The development of the West End as an entertainment district with theatres, music halls, restaurants, and hotels created numerous venues where prostitutes could solicit clients, with the streets around Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus becoming notorious for the presence of sex workers at night. The practice of promenading, where well-dressed prostitutes walked along particular streets at specific times to display themselves to potential clients, became a defining feature of Victorian prostitution in fashionable districts, with women investing in clothing and accessories that would attract the attention of wealthy men. The hierarchy of Victorian prostitution ranged from elite courtesans, who maintained elegant establishments and entertained titled clients, to dollymops, working-class women who occasionally prostituted themselves to supplement regular wages, to desperate street prostitutes who sold services for pennies in back alleys and doorways. The upper tiers of Victorian prostitution included women who operated discreetly from private residences, advertising through word of mouth and discreet cards left in gentlemen's clubs, and who cultivated refined manners and conversation skills that allowed them to socialize with wealthy clients in contexts that resembled courtship more than commercial transactions. The middle market of Victorian prostitution operated through brothels of various qualities, from relatively comfortable establishments with proper furnishings and regular medical inspection of workers, to squalid houses where women lived in conditions of extreme poverty and exploitation. The system of housing prostitutes in brothels owned or managed by keepers who took substantial portions of their earnings continued to create conditions of debt bondage similar to earlier periods, with women charged exorbitant rates for room, board, clothing, and other necessities that made it nearly impossible to save money or leave prostitution. The recruitment of women into Victorian prostitution occurred through various mechanisms, including economic desperation, seduction, and abandonment by lovers that left women pregnant or disgraced, entry through casual prostitution that became permanent, and in some cases, deliberate trafficking or coercion by procurers who identified vulnerable young women. The moral panic regarding juvenile prostitution during the 1880s, sparked partly by W.T. Stead's sensational exposé, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, published in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1885, revealed the existence of organized traffic in very young girls who were procured for prostitution through various means, including purchase from impoverished parents, abduction, or deception. Stead's investigation, which involved the purchase of a 13-year-old girl to demonstrate how easily children could be procured for prostitution, caused a sensation and contributed to the passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raised the age of consent from 13 to 16 and created new penalties for procurement and trafficking. The Contagious Diseases Acts passed in 1864, 1866, and 1869 represented the most systematic Victorian attempt to regulate prostitution through medical inspection and control, though these laws applied only in designated garrison towns and naval ports rather than throughout England. The Acts gave police authority to identify women suspected of prostitution and require them to submit to medical examinations for venereal disease, with infected women subject to detention in lock hospitals until cured, creating a system of state-regulated prostitution that scandalized moral reformers who objected to what they viewed as government licensing of vice. The opposition to the Contagious Diseases Acts, led by Josephine Butler and the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, mounted and sustained campaign that combined feminist arguments about the injustice of regulating women while ignoring male behavior, civil liberties, concerns about police powers, and moral objections to state recognition of prostitution. Josephine Butler's leadership of the repeal campaign transformed her into one of the most prominent Victorian feminists, with her arguments that the acts violated women's bodily autonomy and created a double standard that punished prostitutes while tolerating their male clients, resonating with emerging feminist consciousness. The repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts in 1886 represented a victory for moral reform forces who insisted that prostitution should be suppressed rather than regulated, though the practical effect was to drive the sex trade further underground without reducing its actual prevalence. The development of the social purity movement during the late Victorian period brought together evangelical Christians, feminists, and moral reformers in campaigns to suppress prostitution, raise the age of consent, prohibit indecent publications, and enforce stricter moral standards in English society. The National Vigilance Association, founded in 1885 in the immediate aftermath of the Maiden Tribute scandal, employed agents to investigate vice, prosecute offenders, and campaign for stricter enforcement of laws against prostitution and obscenity. The closure of many brothels in London and other English cities during the 1880s and 1890s resulted partly from more aggressive enforcement, encouraged by social purity organisations, though prostitution continued with sex workers simply operating from different venues or moving to less visible locations. The medical understanding of sexually transmitted diseases improved considerably during the Victorian period, with the identification of specific pathogens, including the gonococcus bacterium discovered in 1879 and the syphilis spirochete, identified in 1905, though effective treatments remained elusive until the 20th century. The lock hospitals that treated venereal disease patients during the Victorian period combined medical care with moral instruction, reflecting the belief that prostitutes needed spiritual redemption as well as physical healing, with patients required to attend religious services and receive moral education as conditions of treatment. The social reformers who investigated prostitution during the Victorian period identified economic factors as primary causes, with the low wages available to working-class women in legitimate occupations such as needlework, domestic service, or factory work, creating conditions where prostitution appeared economically rational despite its moral stigma and physical dangers. The idealization of feminine purity and domesticity in Victorian culture created particularly sharp contradictions regarding prostitution as the cult of the angel in the house that elevated respectable women to moral pedestals coexisted with widespread male use of prostitutes in ways that highlighted the hypocrisy of Victorian sexual morality. The double standard that judged female sexual behavior far more harshly than male conduct meant that women who engaged in prostitution were marked as fallen and irredeemable, while their male clients faced no comparable moral censure or social consequences. The literary treatment of prostitution in Victorian fiction generally avoided explicit description while suggesting the fallen woman's fate through euphemism and implication, with novels like Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth and George Eliot's Adam Bede depicting seduction and ruin that implied prostitution without naming it directly. The actual conditions of life for Victorian prostitutes varied enormously depending on their position in the hierarchy of sex work. But for the majority who worked as street prostitutes or in cheap brothels, life was characterized by poverty, violence, disease, and early death. The threat of violence from clients, pimps, brothel keepers, or random attackers remained constant for Victorian prostitutes, with women having little recourse to legal protection given their illegal status and the reluctance of authorities to investigate crimes against sex workers. The most infamous Victorian crimes involving prostitutes were the Whitechapel murders of 1888, attributed to Jack the Ripper, who killed at least 5 prostitutes in London's East End. With the brutality of these murders and the failure of police to identify the killer, creating a sensation that revealed the vulnerability of street prostitutes and the indifference of authorities to crimes against marginalized women. The international dimensions of prostitution during the Victorian period included the traffic in women from England to continental Europe and to British colonies, with international reform organizations emerging to combat what was called the white slave trade, though the extent and organization of international trafficking were often exaggerated by moral reformers. The expansion of the British Empire created markets for prostitution in colonial cities, including Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Cape Town, where military garrisons and male colonial administrators created demand that drew women from Britain and other countries. The regulation of prostitution in British colonial territories sometimes followed different patterns than in Britain itself, with some colonial administrations maintaining licensed brothel systems similar to those that operated in continental European countries, justified by arguments about military necessity and tropical climates that supposedly intensified male sexual needs. The final decades of the Victorian period saw increasing organization of social purity campaigns, more aggressive prosecution of brothel keepers and traffickers, and growing feminist advocacy for addressing the economic and social conditions that drove women into prostitution, setting the stage for continued debates about prostitution policy that would extend into the 20th century. The Edwardian period and the years preceding the First World War, spanning from Queen Victoria's death in 1901 through the outbreak of war in 1914, witnessed continued transformation in the social landscape of prostitution as new technologies, changing moral attitudes, and evolving forms of entertainment created novel contexts for sexual commerce. The development of electric lighting in urban streets and the expansion of nighttime entertainment venues, including restaurants, theaters, and music halls, extended the hours during which prostitutes could solicit clients while making their activities more visible to both potential customers and reform-minded critics. The introduction of the telephone enabled new forms of brothel operation, where establishments could be contacted discreetly rather than requiring clients to visit publicly, creating opportunities for more hidden forms of sexual commerce that escape the surveillance of authorities and moral reformers. The continuing growth of London and other English cities during the Edwardian period sustained large markets for prostitution, with estimates suggesting that tens of thousands of women remained engaged in sex work despite decades of reform efforts aimed at suppressing the trade. The moral reform organizations that had emerged during the late Victorian period continued their campaigns during the Edwardian years, with the National Vigilance Association and similar groups maintaining pressure on authorities to enforce laws against prostitution and to prosecute brothel keepers and procurers. The white slavery panic that intensified during the years immediately preceding the First World War reflected both genuine concerns about international trafficking and exaggerated fears about organized criminal networks allegedly kidnapping respectable women and forcing them into prostitution abroad. The passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1912, which created new offences related to procurement and living on the earnings of prostitution, represented the government's response to public anxiety about trafficking, though the actual evidence for widespread organised white slavery remained questionable. The development of the cinema during the Edwardian period created new venues where prostitutes could solicit clients, with early picture palaces providing dark spaces where women could proposition men during film screenings, leading to complaints from moral reformers and cinema operators. The changing geography of London prostitution during the Edwardian period reflected both enforcement patterns and urban development, with traditional areas like the Haymarket subject to increased police scrutiny, while new centres emerged in districts like Soho and around railway stations, where transient populations provided anonymity. The expansion of the railway network and the development of suburban commuter systems created new patterns of mobility that affected prostitution, with men travelling to central London for work or entertainment, able to visit prostitutes without risking exposure in their residential communities. The economic context of Edwardian prostitution remained fundamentally similar to Victorian patterns, with women entering sex work primarily due to economic necessity, though the expansion of alternative employment opportunities for women in shops, offices, and light industry may have slightly reduced the proportion of working-class women who turned to prostitution as a survival strategy. The development of the suffrage movement and the broader first-wave feminist campaign brought renewed attention to prostitution as a feminist issue, with activists arguing that women's lack of political rights and economic opportunities created the conditions that drove women into sex work. The militant suffragettes, led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, addressed prostitution in their campaigns, though their focus remained primarily on securing voting rights rather than on directly addressing the sex trade. The social investigation of prostitution continued during the Edwardian period, with researchers conducting surveys and interviews that documented the continuing prevalence of sex work and the difficult conditions facing prostitutes, though the methodologies and conclusions of these studies often reflected the investigators' moral assumptions as much as systematic observation. The medical treatment of venereal disease improved slightly during the early 20th century, with the development of Salvarsan in 1910 providing the first somewhat effective treatment for syphilis, though this medication's toxicity and the difficulty of administering it meant that many patients continued to suffer from untreated infections. The lock hospitals and venereal disease clinics that operated during the Edwardian period continued to combine medical treatment with moral instruction, reflecting the persistent belief that prostitutes needed spiritual reformation as well as physical healing. The artistic and literary treatment of prostitution during the Edwardian period became somewhat more frank than had been typical during the Victorian era, with writers like George Bernard Shaw addressing prostitution directly in plays like Mrs. Warren's Profession, though this work was banned from public performance until 1925 due to its controversial subject matter. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 created unprecedented conditions that would transform patterns of prostitution through the mobilization of millions of men into military service, the movement of populations on scales never before seen, and the disruption of normal social controls that accompanied total war. The concentration of British troops in training camps and garrison towns before deployment to France created enormous demand for prostitutes in areas that had previously seen limited sex trade, with towns near military installations experiencing rapid expansion of prostitution as local women and women travelling from other areas sought to profit from the presence of soldiers with military pay to spend. The military authorities' concerns about venereal disease among troops led to the implementation of various control measures, including the designation of certain towns and districts as out of bounds to military personnel, the establishment of military police patrols to discourage soldiers from visiting prostitutes, and educational campaigns warning about the dangers of venereal infection. The Defence of the Realm Act, passed in August 1914, gave government extensive powers to regulate civilian behavior in ways justified by military necessity, including provisions that would eventually be used to control prostitution near military installations. Regulation 40D, introduced in March 1918, made it an offense for a woman with venereal disease to have sexual relations with any member of the military forces, creating a provision that essentially criminalized infected prostitutes while imposing no comparable penalty on infected soldiers. The feminist opposition to Regulation 40D, led by organizations including the Association for Moral and Social Hygiene, argued that the provision recreated the injustices of the Contagious Diseases Acts by targeting women while ignoring male behavior, and by treating venereal disease as a criminal offense rather than a public health problem. The war years saw increased visibility of prostitution in London and other cities as military personnel on leave sought entertainment and female companionship, with districts near railway stations and entertainment venues experiencing concentrations of sex workers serving servicemen. The disruption of normal employment patterns during the war, with many women taking jobs in munitions, factories, and other war industries, may have reduced the economic pressures driving women into prostitution, though the evidence on this question remains mixed. The presence of troops from across the British Empire and from allied nations, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and eventually the United States, created a diverse clientele for London prostitutes and introduced different cultural attitudes toward prostitution and its regulation. The moral panic regarding amateur prostitutes or good-time girls who allegedly provided sexual services to soldiers without formal commercial transactions reflected anxieties about the war's disruption of normal moral standards, and the increased independence of young women who worked in war industries and enjoyed freedom from traditional family supervision. The establishment of women's police patrols in 1914, initially to monitor women's behavior around military camps and training areas, represented a significant development in the policing of prostitution, with female officers granted authority to question women suspected of soliciting and to bring them before magistrates. The armistice in November 1918 brought millions of servicemen back to Britain, creating temporary spikes in demand for prostitution as demobilized soldiers spent accumulated pay in London and other cities before returning to civilian life. The post-war period saw attempts to reimpose pre-war moral standards through continued enforcement of laws against prostitution and through social reform campaigns, though the war had created lasting changes in social attitudes and behaviors, including increased acceptance of premarital sex and more relaxed moral standards that affected prostitution indirectly. The interwar period between 1918 and 1939 witnessed significant changes in the social and legal context of prostitution, including the emergence of new forms of entertainment that created different venues for sexual commerce, evolving medical understanding and treatment of venereal disease, and continuing debates about the appropriate policy approaches to managing the sex trade. The growth of automobile ownership during the 1920s and 1930s created new patterns of mobility that affected prostitution, with cars providing private spaces for sexual transactions and enabling prostitutes and clients to travel more freely, while also creating new forms of street prostitution as women solicited from vehicles or stood along roads where drivers might stop. The development of nightclubs and dance halls during the 1920s created entertainment venues where prostitutes could meet potential clients in settings that provided cover for commercial sexual transactions disguised as social, dancing, or casual encounters. The impact of the First World War on gender relations and social mores contributed to the emergence of more open discussion of sexuality during the 1920s, with birth control advocacy, the rise of sexology as a field of study, and greater acceptance of female sexuality outside marriage, all affecting the broader context within which prostitution operated. The economic depression of the 1930s created renewed pressures that drove women into prostitution, with widespread unemployment and poverty, making sex work an economic necessity for women who could not find legitimate employment or whose wages proved insufficient to support themselves or their families. The Street Offences Committee, appointed in 1927 to investigate prostitution and recommend policy reforms, produced a report in 1928 that documented the continuing prevalence of street prostitution in London and other English cities, while recommending measures to suppress visible solicitation without criminalizing prostitutes themselves. The committee's recommendations influenced subsequent legislation, including provisions that gave police enhanced powers to arrest women for soliciting, while also acknowledging that criminalization of prostitutes had proven ineffective at reducing the sex trade. The development of more effective treatments for venereal disease during the 1930s, including the use of arsenical compounds and eventually the first sulfur drugs introduced in 1937, improved outcomes for infected patients while also potentially reducing fears about disease that had previously deterred some men from visiting prostitutes. The establishment of venereal disease clinics offering confidential treatment without moral judgment represented a significant advance in public health approaches to sexually transmitted infections, though stigma continued to deter many infected persons from seeking treatment promptly. The artistic and literary treatment of prostitution during the interwar period became increasingly frank, with writers like George Orwell describing encounters with prostitutes in works such as Down and Out in Paris and London, while films occasionally addressed prostitution within the constraints imposed by censorship. The moral reform organizations that had campaigned against prostitution since Victorian times continued their work during the interwar period, though with somewhat diminished influence as social attitudes became more permissive, and the coalition between feminists and evangelical Christians that had driven social purity campaigns began to fragment over questions of sexual freedom and women's rights. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 created conditions similar to those of the First World War, with mass mobilization of military forces, population movements, and the breakdown of normal social controls, creating new opportunities and demands for prostitution. The Second World War period, from 1939 to 1945, witnessed dramatic transformations in the scale and character of prostitution in England, as the presence of millions of military personnel from Britain and Allied nations created unprecedented demand for commercial sexual services, while wartime conditions disrupted normal patterns of enforcement and social regulation. The build-up of British armed forces and the arrival of troops from across the Commonwealth and Empire created military concentrations in garrison towns and ports that attracted prostitutes from across the country, with women travelling to areas where servicemen congregated in hopes of profiting from military pay and the willingness of men facing combat to spend money on entertainment and female companionship. The arrival of American forces in Britain, beginning in 1942, introduced hundreds of thousands of additional servicemen whose relatively high pay and different cultural attitudes towards sexuality and prostitution created new dynamics in the British sex trade. The presence of African American servicemen in segregated American units complicated the racial dimensions of prostitution, with some British prostitutes willing to service black soldiers who faced discrimination in other contexts, while military authorities attempted to enforce segregation in entertainment venues and to discourage interracial sexual contact. The concentration of populations in urban areas that served as targets for German bombing raids created chaotic conditions where normal social controls broke down, and prostitution flourished in environments of danger and uncertainty, with the blackout regulations that required darkening of streets and buildings, providing cover for street prostitution that operated with less visibility than in peacetime. The disruption of family life through evacuation of children, conscription of men, and employment of women in war industries loosened traditional social supervision and created opportunities for sexual relationships outside marriage, including both casual liaisons and commercial prostitution. The government's concerns about venereal disease among military personnel led to extensive educational campaigns, warning servicemen about the dangers of infection, the distribution of condoms to troops, and the establishment of treatment facilities. Though authorities hesitated to implement compulsory medical examination of prostitutes due to feminist opposition that invoked the history of the Contagious Diseases Acts, the Regulation 33B, introduced under wartime emergency powers in March 1942, made it an offence for any person with venereal disease in a communicable form to have sexual intercourse, creating a provision that theoretically applied equally to men and women, but in practice was enforced primarily against prostitutes, who could be more easily identified and controlled by police. The feminist opposition to Regulation 33B echoed earlier campaigns against Regulation 40D during the First World War, with organizations like the Association for Moral and Social Hygiene arguing that the measure discriminated against women and treated disease as a criminal matter rather than a public health problem. The wartime expansion of women's employment in factories, civil defense, and auxiliary military services provided alternatives to prostitution for working-class women, potentially reducing the economic pressures that drove women into sex work, though the evidence suggests that prostitution continued at high levels throughout the war years. The development of amateur prostitution or victory girls, young women who provided sexual services to servicemen without explicit monetary transactions, but with the expectation of receiving entertainment, gifts, or other benefits, represented a phenomenon that blurred the boundaries between prostitution and casual wartime sexual relationships. The presence of large numbers of foreign servicemen created international dimensions to wartime prostitution, with British women sometimes forming relationships with American, Canadian, or other Allied servicemen that involved elements of commercial exchange, emotional attachment, and hopes for post-war emigration. The visibility of prostitution during the war years generated periodic moral panics, with newspaper accounts expressing concern about vice conditions around military camps and in London's West End, where servicemen on leave sought entertainment in nightclubs, dance halls, and other venues where prostitutes operated. The challenges facing police in controlling prostitution during wartime included the enormous scale of the activity, the mobility of both prostitutes and clients, the difficulty of enforcing regulations under blackout conditions, and the ambiguity of many sexual relationships that might or might not constitute prostitution in legal terms. The impact of bombing on urban geography affected prostitution patterns, with the destruction of traditional red light districts forcing prostitutes to relocate to different areas, while bombed-out buildings and damaged structures provided venues for sexual transactions in neighborhoods that had not previously been associated with the sex trade. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 and in Asia in August 1945 brought massive demobilization of military forces and attempts to restore pre-war social patterns, though the war had created lasting changes in attitudes towards sexuality and in the practical conditions under which prostitution operated. The post-war Labour government elected in July 1945 implemented significant social reforms, including the creation of the National Health Service in 1948, which provided free medical treatment for venereal disease and other conditions, potentially improving health outcomes for prostitutes and their clients. The continuation of economic austerity and rationing into the early 1950s meant that post-war conditions remained difficult for many working-class women, potentially sustaining economic incentives for prostitution, even as legitimate employment opportunities expanded. The baby boom following the war and the emphasis on domesticity and traditional family structures in post-war culture created tensions with the continuing presence of visible prostitution, as authorities sought to clean up vice districts and restore moral standards that had been loosened during wartime. The Street Offences Act of 1959 represented a major legislative reform that transformed the legal framework for managing prostitution in England, though the Act emerged from debates and investigations that had been ongoing since the war's end. The Wolfenden Committee, appointed in 1954 to investigate both homosexuality and prostitution and recommend reforms, produced a report in 1957 that analysed the prostitution problem and proposed new approaches focused on removing street prostitution from public view, rather than attempting to eliminate the sex trade entirely. The Wolfenden report argued that prostitution itself should not be criminal, but that soliciting in public spaces created nuisance and offence that justified legal prohibition, recommending increased penalties for street prostitution, while acknowledging that private prostitution between consenting adults could not reasonably be prevented by law. The Street Offences Act of 1959 implemented many of the Wolfenden Committee's recommendations by creating a system of escalating penalties for soliciting, with first and second offences resulting in cautions from police, while subsequent convictions could lead to fines or imprisonment, providing incentives for prostitutes to cease street solicitation without criminalizing all forms of sex work. The immediate impact of the 1959 Act was to dramatically reduce visible street prostitution in London and other English cities. As women working in the sex trade moved indoors to avoid arrest, operating from flats, hotels, and other private premises rather than soliciting on streets. The unintended consequence of driving prostitution indoors was to make sex workers more vulnerable to exploitation by pimps and organized criminals who controlled indoor venues and extracted portions of prostitutes' earnings in exchange for providing premises and protection. The development of call girl systems during the 1960s, where prostitutes advertised through contact magazines, cards placed in phone boxes, and eventually through more sophisticated networks, represented adaptation to the changed legal environment created by the Street Offences Act. The 1960s witnessed broader social transformations, including the sexual revolution, the development of youth counterculture, the expansion of higher education, and the emergence of second-wave feminism, all of which affected attitudes towards sexuality and prostitution in complex ways. The passage of the Sexual Offences Act, 1967, which partially decriminalised homosexuality in England and Wales, reflected changing attitudes towards sexual behaviour and reduced emphasis on using criminal law to enforce private morality, creating a context where some advocates argued for similar reforms regarding prostitution. The development of the women's liberation movement during the late 1960s and early 1970s brought renewed feminist attention to prostitution, though feminists disagreed fundamentally about whether sex work should be understood as labor that women should have the right to perform, or as exploitation that could never be truly consensual given gender power imbalances. The expansion of sex industry venues during the 1970s, including strip clubs, massage parlors, and escort services, created new forms of commercial sexual activity that operated in legal grey areas, not clearly prohibited by existing laws, but potentially subject to prosecution under various statutes. The economic difficulties of the 1970s, including high inflation, rising unemployment, and fiscal crises, may have increased economic pressures driving women into sex work, though systematic evidence on the relationship between economic conditions and prostitution rates remains limited. The late 20th century period, from the 1980s through the end of the millennium, witnessed significant changes in the organization, visibility, and regulation of prostitution in England, shaped by factors including HIV and AIDS, feminist debates about sex work, changing technologies of communication and advertising, and evolving criminal justice approaches to managing the sex trade. The emergence of HIV and AIDS in the early 1980s created a public health crisis that affected prostitution policy, with authorities recognizing that sex workers faced elevated risks of infection and that transmission through prostitution could spread disease to the broader population via clients who had sexual contact with both prostitutes and other partners. The initial responses to AIDS among sex workers included the development of peer education programs, the distribution of condoms, and the establishment of health services specifically designed to reach prostitutes, representing a public health approach that prioritized harm reduction over moral condemnation or criminal enforcement. The English Collective of Prostitutes, established in 1975, advocated for decriminalization of prostitution and better working conditions for sex workers, framing prostitution as legitimate work deserving of labor rights rather than as victimization or crime. The feminist debates regarding prostitution intensified during the 1980s and 1990s, with radical feminists arguing that prostitution constituted violence against women and could never be freely chosen under patriarchal conditions, while sex worker rights advocates and some liberal feminists contended that criminalizing prostitution harmed the women it purported to protect, and that adults should have autonomy over their sexual and economic choices. The development of street prostitution in specific urban areas created local controversies, with residents in affected neighborhoods demanding action against visible sex trade, while outreach workers and some activists argued that dispersing prostitutes through enforcement made them more vulnerable to violence. The murders of prostitutes in various English cities during the 1980s and 1990s highlighted the dangers facing street sex workers with the Yorkshire Ripper case involving 13 murders between 1975 and 1980, particularly demonstrating both the vulnerability of prostitutes to predatory violence and the inadequate police response to crimes against sex workers. The growth of indoor prostitution through escort agencies, massage parlors, and independent work from flats represented continuing adaptation to the legal environment created by the 1959 Street Offences Act, with sex workers seeking to avoid street solicitation while still marketing their services to potential clients. The development of new communication technologies during the 1980s and 1990s, including mobile phones, pagers, and eventually the internet revolutionized how prostitutes advertised their services and communicated with clients, enabling more sophisticated organization of sex work and reducing reliance on street solicitation. The expansion of international travel and migration during the late 20th century brought increasing numbers of foreign women to work in English prostitution, with women from Thailand, Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism, and Latin America entering the British sex trade through various pathways, including trafficking, voluntary migration for sex work, and migration for other purposes followed by entry into prostitution. The growing awareness of trafficking for sexual exploitation led to increased law enforcement attention and the development of policies aimed at identifying and assisting trafficked persons, though distinguishing between trafficked victims and voluntary migrant sex workers proved difficult and controversial. The Sexual Offences Act of 1985 created offences related to soliciting by men, applying prohibitions on street solicitation to male prostitutes as well as female sex workers, while also updating provisions regarding curb crawling, making it an offence for men to solicit prostitutes from vehicles in ways that cause nuisance or concern to other road users or nearby residents. The debates regarding curb crawler rehabilitation programs that attempted to educate men arrested for soliciting about the harms of prostitution reflected different philosophical approaches, with some viewing prostitution primarily through a public order lens focused on nuisance, while others emphasized exploitation and violence against women. The increasing visibility of human rights frameworks during the 1990s influenced debates about prostitution policy, with advocates drawing on international human rights law to argue both that sex workers deserved protection of their rights and that prostitution violated women's human rights, depending on the speaker's perspective on the nature of sex work. The development of sauna brothels and massage parlors as venues for prostitution during the 1980s and 1990s created establishments that operated semi-openly, advertising services that ostensibly did not include sexual activity while functioning as commercial sex venues, where prostitutes rented rooms or worked as employees. The use of euphemistic advertising, including cards placed in phone boxes featuring images of women in revealing clothing and offering relaxation or personal services, enabled prostitutes to market their services while avoiding explicit admissions that might constitute evidence of soliciting or brothel-keeping offences. The expansion of adult entertainment industry, including strip clubs, lap dancing venues, and pornography, created new forms of commercial sexuality that existed in relationship to prostitution, with some establishments serving as fronts for sex work, while others operated legitimately within regulations governing entertainment, licensing. The changing ethnic composition of prostitution in English cities reflected broader patterns of migration and globalization, with research studies documenting that significant proportions of women working in prostitution were foreign-born migrants from Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa, raising questions about the intersection of migration policy, labor rights, and prostitution regulation. The emergence of academic sex work studies as a field during the 1990s brought increased scholarly attention to prostitution, with researchers from sociology, criminology, anthropology, and other disciplines conducting empirical studies of sex workers' experiences, market organization, policy impacts, and public health dimensions. The publication of ethnographic research based on interviews with sex workers and observation of prostitution markets provided evidence that challenged some common assumptions, suggesting that many women exercised agency in deciding to engage in sex work, that exit from prostitution was possible and occurred regularly, and that sex workers face diverse circumstances rather than fitting a single profile of victimization. The continuing debates among feminists, policymakers, law enforcement officials, public health practitioners, and sex workers themselves regarding the appropriate legal and policy frameworks for managing prostitution reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of sex work, the possibility of consent under conditions of economic inequality, and the relative importance of harm reduction versus abolition as policy goals. The 21st century period, from 2000 onward, has witnessed accelerating changes in the technology, organization, and regulation of prostitution in England, driven by the Internet revolution, changing migration patterns, evolving feminist and human rights discourses, and continuing debates about the appropriate legal frameworks for managing commercial sexual services. The proliferation of Internet-based platforms for advertising and arranging prostitution transformed the sex trade during the 2000s and 2010s, with websites enabling prostitutes to create detailed profiles, advertising their services, rates, and availability, while allowing clients to search for sex workers meeting specific criteria and to post reviews of their experiences. The development of online forums, where clients of prostitutes shared information about sex workers, discussed pricing and services, and posted detailed reviews, created new market dynamics, where reputation and client feedback became significant factors affecting prostitutes' success and earning potential. The websites providing platforms for prostitution advertising operated in legal grey areas, typically claiming that they merely facilitated adult personal services rather than explicitly enabling prostitution, though law enforcement and policymakers increasingly recognize these platforms as central infrastructure for the contemporary sex trade. The attempts by some local authorities to shut down prostitution websites through legal action or pressure on internet service providers generally proved ineffective, as sites simply moved to hosting services in other jurisdictions, or new platforms emerged to replace those that were closed. The smartphone revolution during the 2010s further transformed prostitution by enabling prostitutes and clients to communicate directly through calls, texts, and messaging apps, coordinate meetings with precision, and operate with flexibility that made traditional forms of organized prostitution less necessary. The development of online payment systems, including bank transfers, digital payment platforms, and eventually cryptocurrency, provided additional mechanisms for financial transactions associated with prostitution, reducing the need for cash exchanges and creating new opportunities for both legitimate business practices and financial exploitation. The Policing and Crime Act of 2009 represented a significant legislative intervention that created strict liability offence for paying for sexual services of a person who has been subjected to force, threats, coercion, or deception, effectively criminalising men who purchase sex from trafficked women, regardless of whether the client knew or should have known about the coercion. The government's stated rationale for this provision emphasised the prevalence of trafficking and exploitation in prostitution and the responsibility of clients to ensure that women they paid for sex were working voluntarily, though critics argued that the measure was based on exaggerated claims about trafficking prevalence and that strict liability principles were inappropriate for serious criminal offences. The research evidence regarding the extent of trafficking for sexual exploitation in the United Kingdom remained contested throughout the 2000s and 2010s, with different studies using varying methodologies and definitions, producing estimates ranging from hundreds to tens of thousands of trafficked victims, reflecting the inherent difficulties in measuring a hidden population and the politically charged nature of trafficking debates. The legal framework governing prostitution in England during the early 21st century remained based primarily on the Street Offences Act, 1959, and subsequent amendments, maintaining the prohibition on soliciting in public while leaving private prostitution between consenting adults, technically legal, though surrounded by criminal offences related to brothel keeping, living on the earnings of prostitution, and various forms of exploitation. The practical effect of this legal framework was to create a system where sex work itself was nominally lawful, but virtually all forms of organisation, cooperation between sex workers, or commercial facilitation of prostitution were criminal, forcing prostitutes to work in isolation or in illegal establishments. The debate regarding full decriminalization of prostitution, advocated by organizations like the English Collective of Prostitutes and the Sex Workers Alliance, emphasized that removing criminal penalties would enable sex workers to cooperate for safety, report crimes without fear of arrest, and access labor rights available to other workers. The feminist abolitionist position, articulated by organizations including the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and Nordic Model Now, argued that prostitution constituted violence against women, that the vast majority of women in prostitution were exploited victims rather than autonomous workers, and that decriminalization would expand the sex trade and increase exploitation rather than improving conditions. The Nordic or Swedish model of prostitution policy, implemented in Sweden in 1999 and subsequently adopted by Norway, Iceland, and other countries, prohibited the purchase of sexual services while decriminalizing the sale, creating asymmetric legal framework that treated prostitutes as victims rather than criminals, while targeting demand by criminalizing clients. The campaigns by feminist abolitionists to persuade the British government to adopt the Nordic model gained significant political traction during the 2010s, with supporters arguing that this approach combined concern for women's welfare with recognition that prostitution fundamentally violated women's equality and dignity. The opposition to the Nordic model from sex worker rights advocates and some academics emphasized research evidence from Nordic countries, suggesting that criminalization of clients had driven prostitution underground, reduced sex workers' ability to screen clients and work safely, and created new vulnerabilities rather than protecting women as claimed by supporters. The murder of sex workers continued to highlight the dangers facing prostitutes, with cases like the Ipswich serial murders in 2006 and the deaths of individual sex workers in suspicious circumstances, generating media coverage and policy debates about whether the legal framework increased vulnerability to violence. The development of the Ugly Mugs scheme, a national intelligence system where sex workers could report dangerous clients and share information about men who had committed violence or other crimes, represented a harm reduction approach that recognized the continuing reality of prostitution while attempting to improve safety for women working in the trade. The expansion of indoor sex work, including women working independently from flats, through escort agencies, or in commercial venues like massage parlors, represented the dominant form of prostitution in early 21st century England, with street prostitution declining to relatively small numbers, concentrated in specific areas of certain cities. The phenomenon of pop-up brothels, temporary commercial sex venues operating from rented flats or hotel rooms for brief periods before relocating, represented adaptation to enforcement patterns where police focused resources on shutting down established brothels, creating incentives for mobile and temporary operations. The increasing diversity of England's sex trade included transgender prostitutes, male sex workers serving male clients, and various niche markets catering to specific sexual interests, though the majority of commercial sexual transactions continued to involve men paying women for heterosexual services. The economic context of prostitution in the 21st century included women entering sex work for diverse reasons, ranging from desperate poverty and survival, needs to debt repayment, drug addiction, and coercion, to voluntary choice of sex work as preferable to available alternatives given individual circumstances and preferences. The research evidence suggested that women's pathways into prostitution were diverse and that experiences in the sex trade varied widely, with some women reporting exploitation, violence, and desperation, while others described autonomy, adequate earnings, and acceptance of prostitution as work rather than victimization. The prices for sexual services in the 21st century English prostitution market ranged from perhaps £20 to £40 for brief sexual encounters with street prostitutes to hundreds of pounds per hour for escort services, with variations depending on location, services provided, and the prostitute's market positioning. The impact of economic recession following the 2008 financial crisis on prostitution remained unclear, with some evidence suggesting that economic hardship increased the number of women entering sex work, while simultaneously reducing clients' disposable income and driving down prices in what became a buyer's market. The development of academic research centers and university programs focusing on sex work created growing bodies of empirical evidence regarding prostitution. Though this research often became caught up in political debates, as different camps cited studies supporting their preferred policy positions, while dismissing contradictory evidence as methodologically flawed or politically motivated. The Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry into prostitution conducted between 2014 and 2016 examined evidence regarding the scale and nature of the sex trade, the effectiveness of current laws, and the potential impacts of alternative legal frameworks, ultimately producing a divided report where the committee could not reach consensus on recommending major policy reforms. The expansion of the sexual services that could be purchased reflected both changing sexual cultures and the pressures of market competition, with prostitutes offering increasingly diverse and specialized services to attract clients and command higher prices in competitive markets. The development of sugar daddy arrangements facilitated by websites connecting wealthy men with younger women seeking financial support created commercial sexual relationships that occupied ambiguous spaces between prostitution, dating, and longer-term financial relationships, with participants sometimes rejecting the label of prostitution despite the explicit exchange of money and gifts for sexual access. The migration flows, bringing women from Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa to work in English prostitution, created complex dynamics involving trafficking, smuggling, voluntary migration for sex work, and migration followed by entry into prostitution due to circumstances in destination countries. The expansion of the European Union and the freedom of movement rights granted to citizens of new member states in 2004 and 2007 brought significant numbers of Romanian, Bulgarian, and other Eastern European women to England, with some entering prostitution, either voluntarily or through coercion, by trafficking networks. The enforcement of anti-trafficking laws proved challenging due to difficulties identifying victims who might be unwilling to cooperate with authorities due to fear of traffickers, distrust of police, concerns about deportation, or because they did not identify as victims, despite circumstances that legally constituted trafficking. The debates regarding prostitution policy continued to divide feminists, policymakers, law enforcement officials, and sex workers themselves, with fundamental disagreements about whether prostitution could ever be freely chosen, whether criminalization protected or harmed sex workers, and whether the sex trade should be eliminated or regulated. The emergence of social media platforms created new venues for discussing prostitution policy, with sex workers using Twitter, blogs, and other platforms to share their perspectives and challenge representations of prostitution that they viewed as inaccurate or harmful, giving sex workers' voices greater visibility in public debates than had been possible in earlier eras. The Me Too movement, beginning in 2017, brought renewed attention to sexual exploitation and coercion, with some advocates arguing that prostitution represented part of a broader pattern of male sexual entitlement and violence against women, while sex worker rights advocates sometimes found themselves in difficult positions regarding a movement that appeared to conflate consensual sex work with sexual assault and exploitation. The contemporary period from 2020 onward has been shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic, accelerating technological changes, including artificial intelligence and virtual reality, continuing debates about appropriate legal frameworks, and evolving understandings of gender, sexuality, and commercial sexual exchange that have influenced how prostitution is practiced and regulated in England. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in early 2020 created unprecedented disruptions to prostitution as lockdown measures prohibited most face-to-face commercial activities, with sex workers losing income sources and facing difficult choices about whether to continue working illegally during lockdowns at risk to their health and that of clients. The development of online sexual services, including webcam performances, custom video creation, and interactive virtual experiences, represented adaptation to pandemic conditions, with some sex workers transitioning temporarily or permanently to online work that avoided physical contact while still providing commercial sexual content. The economic support provided by government through furlough schemes and other pandemic relief programs generally excluded sex workers who could not declare illegal income sources, creating severe hardship for prostitutes who lost income without access to the safety nets available to workers in legal industries. The pandemic highlighted the precarious legal status of sex workers and the vulnerabilities created by criminalization that prevented them from accessing support services available to others affected by economic shutdowns. The gradual reopening of society during 2021 and 2022 saw the resumption of in-person prostitution, though with some sex workers and clients maintaining heightened health concerns and adopting new practices intended to reduce disease transmission risks. The impact of Brexit on prostitution in England included changes to migration patterns affecting the supply of sex workers, with European Union citizens losing automatic rights to live and work in the UK, and potentially facing increased barriers to entry that might affect the demographics and organisation of prostitution. The continuing debates regarding prostitution policy during the early 2020s reflected unresolved tensions between different feminist perspectives, with radical feminists and abolitionists continuing to advocate for adoption of the Nordic model that would criminalise purchase of sexual services, while sex worker rights organisations and some academics argued for full decriminalisation of prostitution and recognition of sex work as legitimate labour. The attempts by some local authorities and police forces to experiment with different approaches to managing prostitution, including managed zones, where police agreed not to enforce soliciting laws in specific areas in exchange for cooperation with health and safety initiatives, represented pragmatic harm reduction efforts that acknowledged the persistence of prostitution while attempting to minimize negative consequences. The development of increasingly sophisticated online platforms for facilitating prostitution reflected technological advances, with some websites incorporating verification systems, review mechanisms, and booking features that created digital marketplaces for sexual services operating globally while serving local markets. The application of artificial intelligence to analyze patterns in prostitution, advertising, and identify potential trafficking victims represented one use of new technology in law enforcement approaches to the sex trade, though concerns about privacy, accuracy, and the potential for algorithmic bias complicated implementation. The expansion of the gig economy and platform-based work during the 2020s created comparisons with prostitution, as both involved individuals selling services through digital platforms with limited worker protections and complex questions about employment status and labor rights. The debates about sex robots and virtual reality sexual experiences raised questions about the future of prostitution, with some speculating that technological substitutes might reduce demand for human sex workers, while others argued that desire for authentic human interaction would sustain markets for prostitution, regardless of technological alternatives. The discussions regarding reparations for historical injustices and the examination of institutions' complicity in exploitation brought renewed attention to the historical role of religious and governmental authorities in profiting from prostitution. Though specific reparations proposals focused primarily on slavery and colonialism rather than the sex trade, the increasing visibility of transgender individuals and growing acceptance of gender diversity affected prostitution markets and policy debates, with transgender sex workers facing particular vulnerabilities due to the intersection of stigma regarding both sex work and gender identity. The legal recognition of various forms of non-traditional relationships, including civil partnerships between opposite-sex couples, and increased acceptance of polyamory and open relationships, created contexts where some arrangements involving financial support in exchange for sexual access existed in grey areas between prostitution and recognized relationship forms. The continuing evolution of feminist thought included ongoing debates about agency, choice, and consent under conditions of structural inequality, with questions about whether prostitution could be freely chosen when economic options were limited remaining central to disagreements about appropriate policy frameworks. The practical reality of prostitution in early 21st century England involved thousands of women, smaller numbers of men and transgender individuals selling sexual services through various means, including street solicitation in limited areas, working from flats independently or in illegal brothels, operating through escort agencies, and advertising through internet platforms. The clients of prostitutes continued to come from all social classes and backgrounds, with research suggesting that significant minorities of men in England had paid for sex at some point in their lives, though the proportions appeared to have declined somewhat from earlier decades, possibly due to changing sexual cultures and easier access to casual sexual encounters through dating apps. The prices for sexual services reflected market segmentation, with street prostitution commanding lower prices than indoor services, and with elite escorts earning substantially more than women working in less prestigious market segments. The health risks associated with prostitution included sexually transmitted infections, though rates appeared lower than in historical periods due to more consistent condom use and better access to testing and treatment. Violence from clients, though difficult to quantify precisely, and mental health impacts that some research suggested were significant, while other studies found varied experiences depending on circumstances. The social stigma attached to prostitution remained significant in early 21st century England, with women working in the sex trade facing discrimination, difficulties accessing some services, and often concealing their involvement in prostitution from family, friends, and others outside the industry. The movement of some former sex workers into activism and advocacy represented efforts to challenge stigma and influence policy debates, with organizations led by people with lived experience of prostitution playing increasingly prominent roles in discussions about appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks. The academic study of prostitution continued to generate research examining various dimensions of the sex trade, including market organization, the effectiveness of different legal regimes, public health outcomes, and the experiences of sex workers, though translating research findings into policy reforms remained challenging, given the politically contentious nature of prostitution regulation. The international dimensions of prostitution policy debates included attention to experiences in other countries that had implemented different legal frameworks, with supporters of various approaches pointing to evidence from the Netherlands, which had legalized and regulated prostitution, New Zealand, which had fully decriminalized sex work, or Nordic countries which had criminalized purchase while decriminalizing sale, though interpreting the impacts of different policies remained contested. The legal framework governing prostitution in England at the time of writing maintains the system established through the Street Offences Act 1959 and subsequent amendments, where selling sexual services is legal but soliciting in public, brothel keeping, pimping, and various forms of facilitation remain criminal offences, creating a policy framework that satisfies neither abolitionists who want prostitution eliminated, nor sex worker rights advocates who seek full decriminalisation. The practical implementation of prostitution law in contemporary England operates through a complex interplay of police priorities, prosecutorial discretion, and local community pressures that creates highly variable enforcement patterns across different regions and jurisdictions, with some areas maintaining aggressive enforcement of soliciting laws, while others adopt de facto tolerance, provided that prostitution remains relatively invisible and generates no community complaints. The resource constraints facing police forces during the 2010s and 2020s, with budgets reduced following the austerity policies implemented after the 2008 financial crisis, meant that prostitution enforcement generally occupied low priority status compared to violent crime, serious property offences, and terrorism, resulting in limited proactive policing of the sex trade, except when specific complaints from residents or businesses prompted intervention. The concentration of remaining street prostitution in specific areas of certain cities, including parts of Bradford, Leeds, and Ipswich, reflected both historical patterns where particular streets had long been associated with the sex trade and the practical dynamics of police enforcement that created displacement effects, with prostitutes moving away from areas of intense police attention toward locations where enforcement was lighter or where community tolerance was higher. The persistence of visible street prostitution, despite decades of law enforcement efforts, and the implementation of the Street Offences Act's escalating penalty system demonstrated the limited effectiveness of criminalisation, eliminating prostitution, with women continuing to solicit in public spaces because economic necessity outweighed fear of arrest, and because alternative venues for sex work were unavailable or unattractive given individual circumstances. The development of street prostitution strategies that involved women working in teams for mutual safety, using mobile phones to communicate about dangerous clients or police presence, and employing lookouts who could warn of approaching threats, represented rational adaptations to the risks inherent in outdoor sex work in a criminalized environment. The curb-crawling laws that made it an offense for men to solicit prostitutes from vehicles had limited impact on demand for street prostitution, with evaluations suggesting that arrest and prosecution of clients produced temporary reductions in activity that quickly recovered as new clients replaced those deterred by enforcement. While the educational programs offered to arrested curb crawlers as alternatives to prosecution showed mixed results, with some men apparently deterred from future solicitation, while others simply became more cautious in their approach. The indoor prostitution market that dominates contemporary English sex work encompasses diverse organizational forms, including women working independently from residential flats, who advertise through internet platforms and communicate directly with clients, escort agencies that employ or contract with multiple sex workers and handle booking and logistics while taking substantial commissions, massage parlors, and saunas that provide venues where prostitutes rent rooms or work as employees, and various informal arrangements where women work from hotels, service apartments, or clients' residences. The legal ambiguity surrounding much indoor prostitution creates challenges for both sex workers attempting to operate legally and police seeking to enforce laws against brothel keeping. As the definition of a brothel, under English law, as premises used by more than one person for prostitution, means that two women working together from a flat, for safety, technically operate an illegal brothel, subject to prosecution. The practical effect of this legal provision is to force women who wish to work legally to work alone, thereby increasing their vulnerability to violence from clients who arrive at premises where no one else is present to intervene or call for help if an assault occurs, creating a situation where the law intended to combat exploitation actually increases danger for sex workers. The attempts by some sex workers to challenge the two-person brothel rule through judicial review and advocacy for legal reform have thus far been unsuccessful, with courts upholding the current interpretation and Parliament showing no appetite for amending legislation that would be politically controversial and that would be attacked by abolitionists as legitimizing prostitution. The escort agencies that facilitate much contemporary indoor prostitution operate in legal grey zones, typically claiming that they provide companionship services only and that any sexual activity between escorts and clients occurs by mutual agreement between adults rather than as part of the commercial transaction, though everyone involved understands that sexual services constitute the actual product being sold. The commission structures employed by escort agencies typically involve the agency taking between 30 and 50% of the fee charged to clients, with the remainder going to the sex worker who provides the actual service, creating arrangements that some argue constitute living off the earnings of prostitution in ways that should be illegal under existing law, while others view as legitimate business operations that provide valuable services, including advertising, screening of clients, booking management, and some degree of security. The diversity of escort agencies ranges from sophisticated operations with professional websites, careful vetting of both workers and clients, and attention to safety and discretion, to exploitative operations that pressure women to accept bookings they would prefer to refuse, that fail to screen clients adequately, and that take excessive commissions while providing minimal support or protection. The role of technology in shaping contemporary prostitution extends beyond simple advertising and communication to encompass sophisticated systems for reputation management, client screening, and market coordination that have transformed how the sex trade operates. The development of client review websites where men who have purchased sexual services post detailed accounts of their experiences, including descriptions of sex workers' appearance, services provided, locations, prices, and overall satisfaction creates information asymmetries that advantage clients, while potentially exposing sex workers to risks, including stalking, harassment, and demands for specific services based on previous clients' reports. The participation of sex workers in these review systems remains contested, with some women actively cultivating positive reviews by encouraging satisfied clients to post feedback that will attract future business, while others object to the objectifying nature of detailed public reviews of their bodies and sexual performances, and still others recognize reviews as inevitable aspects of contemporary sex work that must be managed strategically, regardless of personal preferences. The accuracy and reliability of client review websites remains questionable, with incentives for both workers and clients to game the system through fake reviews, selective reporting of experiences, and retaliatory negative reviews when disputes arise. While the explicit sexual content of many reviews creates additional legal ambiguities regarding whether hosting such content might constitute facilitation of prostitution in ways that could expose platform operators to criminal liability. The development of client blacklists, where sex workers share information about dangerous or problematic clients, represents another technology-enabled safety mechanism, with platforms like the National Ugly Mug scheme coordinating intelligence about violent or exploitative clients across the country, though the effectiveness of such systems depends on sex workers' willingness to report incidents and on the ability to verify reports to prevent false accusations. The encryption technologies and anonymous communication platforms that enable prostitutes and clients to communicate with some protection from surveillance by law enforcement or others create tensions between privacy rights and legitimate law enforcement interests in identifying trafficking victims and prosecuting exploitation, with debates about encryption backdoors and lawful access to communications involving the sex trade, alongside broader discussions about digital privacy and security. The intersection of prostitution with the digital platform economy creates parallels and contrasts with other forms of gig work that illuminate broader questions about labor rights, worker classification, and the appropriate regulatory frameworks for platform-mediated services. The prostitutes who advertise through websites like Adult Work or VivaStreet occupy positions similar in some respects to Uber drivers or Deliveroo riders who use digital platforms to connect with customers while maintaining nominal independence as self-employed contractors, though the illegal status of many prostitution-related activities creates asymmetries where sex workers cannot access the limited legal protections available to workers in legal platform economies. The debates among labor economists and legal scholars regarding worker classification and whether platform workers should be considered employees entitled to benefits and protections or genuinely independent contractors extend logically to sex workers. Though the criminalization of prostitution-related activities prevents serious consideration of sex workers' labor rights in mainstream policy discussions, the arguments advanced by sex worker rights organizations that decriminalization would enable prostitutes to access labor protections, including employment rights, workplace safety regulations, and anti-discrimination provisions, draw on broader critiques of the gig economy that emphasize worker vulnerability in platform-mediated markets, with unequal power relations between workers and platform operators or clients. The opposition from feminist abolitionists to frameworks that treat prostitution as work emphasizes their contention that commercial sexual exploitation should not be legitimized through language of labor rights, and that the appropriate response is to eliminate prostitution rather than to regulate it as an industry, with abolitionists arguing that the comparison between sex work and other forms of platform labor obscures the distinctive harms of prostitution that involve commodification of women's bodies and sexuality in ways fundamentally different from delivery of meals or provision of rides. The economic analysis of prostitution markets in contemporary England reveals dynamics, including supply and demand elasticities, price discrimination, information asymmetries, and network effects that demonstrate how the sex trade operates according to economic principles, while also being shaped by the specific legal and social contexts of criminalization and stigma. The price variations for sexual services reflect multiple factors, including the sex worker's physical appearance and age, with younger women and those conforming to conventional beauty standards generally able to command higher prices. The services offered and duration of encounters, with specialized services or extended appointments costing more than brief sexual transactions. The venue and setting, with hotel-based escort services generally priced higher than flat-based work or street prostitution, and the reputation and marketing of individual sex workers, with well-reviewed escorts able to charge premium prices based on established brands. The economic returns to prostitution vary enormously across the market hierarchy, with successful high-end escorts potentially earning hundreds of pounds per hour and working selectively with a small number of regular clients, while women engaged in survival, sex work at the bottom of the market, may receive only £20 or £30 per transaction and need to serve numerous clients daily, simply to subsist. The calculation of net income for prostitutes must account for significant expenses, including advertising costs on websites that charge substantial fees for premium listings, rental of premises, whether residential flats or hotel rooms used for meeting clients, transportation to and from appointments, particularly for outcall escort work, clothing and personal presentation, expenses to maintain appearance, standards that attract clients, healthcare costs including contraception and sexually transmitted infection testing, and in many cases, payments to agencies, drivers, or others who facilitate or control the work. The economic vulnerability of many women in prostitution stems partly from the inability to save or invest earnings for future security, with income consumed by immediate living expenses, debts incurred prior to or during involvement in sex work, and in some cases, drug or alcohol dependencies that absorb whatever money is earned, creating cycles of poverty that persist despite sometimes substantial gross earnings from prostitution. The relationship between drug dependency and prostitution represents one of the most troubling aspects of the contemporary sex trade, with research consistently finding high rates of substance abuse among prostitutes, particularly those working in street markets, though the direction of causation remains complex and likely operates in both directions, with drug use sometimes preceding entry into prostitution and sometimes developing as a coping mechanism for the trauma and degradation of sex work. The women engaged in street prostitution in English cities during the 2020s include significant numbers of individuals with problematic drug use, particularly of crack, cocaine, and heroin, whose need to fund expensive addictions drives them to engage in survival sex work under conditions of extreme desperation and vulnerability. The connection between drug markets and prostitution creates situations where dealers, criminal organizations, or individual men exercise control over addicted women through supply of drugs, deliberately fostering dependencies that enable exploitation and extraction of prostitution earnings. The harm reduction services provided by outreach workers who engage with drug-using sex workers attempt to address multiple intersecting vulnerabilities by providing clean needles to reduce HIV and hepatitis transmission, condoms to prevent sexually transmitted infection and unwanted pregnancy, basic healthcare and social services, and information about treatment programs for those wishing to address substance dependencies. Though the effectiveness of these interventions is limited by the severe challenges facing individuals dealing simultaneously with addiction, prostitution, often trauma, and frequently unstable housing or homelessness. The heroin-assisted treatment programs piloted in some English cities during the 2000s and 2010s demonstrated some success in reducing criminal activity, including prostitution, among severely addicted individuals who had not responded to conventional methadone maintenance, by providing pharmaceutical heroin under medical supervision that eliminated the need to generate income for expensive street drugs. Though the political controversy surrounding prescribing heroin and the limited availability of such programs meant that only small numbers of individuals received this intervention, the housing instability and homelessness that characterize the circumstances of many women in prostitution reflect broader patterns of poverty, social exclusion, and inadequate social safety nets that create vulnerabilities across multiple dimensions of life. The women engaged in survival sex work frequently lack stable housing, instead living in temporary accommodations, shelters, squats, or literally on the streets, creating situations where prostitution becomes means not only of generating income, but also of securing temporary shelter when clients pay for hotel rooms or when relationships with clients provide places to stay. The difficulties that sex workers face in accessing stable housing include discrimination by landlords who may be unwilling to rent to known prostitutes, inability to provide employment references or demonstrate legitimate income sources required by most rental agreements, insufficient income from prostitution to afford market-rate housing, particularly given the irregular and unpredictable nature of earnings, and in some cases, histories of rent, arrears, evictions, or other tenancy problems that create barriers to accessing social or private rental housing. The increased use of online advertising and verification systems by landlords to screen potential tenants has created additional challenges for sex workers who wish to maintain privacy about their involvement in prostitution, but who find that internet searches may reveal advertising or reviews that expose their sex work to landlords conducting background checks. The attempts by some local authorities to address the intersection of homelessness and prostitution through housing-first approaches that provide permanent housing without preconditions, including cessation of prostitution or drug use, represent recognition that housing stability must precede rather than follow resolution of other life challenges, though the availability of such programs remains limited, and many women in prostitution continue to experience extreme housing insecurity. The violence against sex workers remains one of the most serious harms associated with prostitution, with research consistently documenting high rates of physical assault, rape, robbery, and in extreme cases, murder perpetrated against women working in the sex trade by clients, pimps, partners, or random attackers who target prostitutes, perceiving them as vulnerable and unlikely to report victimization to police. The serial murders of sex workers that periodically occur in English cities demonstrate the extreme vulnerability of women engaged in street prostitution, who often work alone in isolated areas, who enter vehicles or premises with strangers, and who face clients knowing that their illegal status makes reporting suspicious behavior or seeking police protection difficult or impossible. The murders of 5 women working in street prostitution in Ipswich during late 2006 illustrated both the horrifying reality of violence against sex workers and the inadequate police response to crimes against marginalized women, with investigations revealing that several victims had reported suspicious incidents or dangerous clients before their murders, but that police had not taken effective action to protect them or to identify the perpetrator before additional women were killed. The Ipswich murders generated national debate about prostitution policy, with some arguing that criminalization increased vulnerability by forcing women to work in dangerous conditions without access to police protection, while others contended that prostitution itself inherently exposed women to predatory men, and that the appropriate response was to eliminate the sex trade rather than to attempt to make it safer. The violence that sex workers experience includes not only extreme acts like murder, but also routine physical and sexual assaults, with studies finding that substantial majorities of prostitutes report having experienced violence during their involvement in sex work, including rape by clients who refuse to accept refusal of particular sexual acts or who attack when prostitutes attempt to enforce boundaries. Physical assault, including beating or choking, often associated with robbery attempts, and threats of violence used to intimidate and control. The relationship between criminalization and violence against sex workers operates through multiple mechanisms, including forcing prostitutes to work in isolated locations to avoid police surveillance, thereby increasing vulnerability to attack, preventing sex workers from reporting crimes to police for fear of being arrested themselves, creating social marginalization that communicates to potential perpetrators that society does not value prostitutes' safety or well-being, and prohibiting prostitutes from working together in ways that would provide mutual protection and witnesses who could intervene or summon help during attacks. The experiences of violence vary across different sectors of the prostitution market, with women working in street prostitution facing highest risks due to the need to make quick decisions about accepting clients under time pressure from police surveillance, the conduct of transactions in vehicles or outdoor locations where no one can intervene if violence occurs, and the desperation that drives survival sex work, leading women to accept clients despite warning signs of danger. The indoor prostitution market generally provides somewhat greater safety than street work, due to the ability of sex workers to screen clients before meetings, to work from premises where they have some control over the environment, and to use technology, including phones that enable contact with others who can check on safety. Though indoor sex workers still experience significant levels of violence, particularly when working alone, as required by the two-person brothel rule, or when visiting clients at their residences or hotels, where the client controls the space. The violence perpetrated by intimate partners against women in prostitution constitutes another dimension of harm, with research documenting high rates of domestic abuse in the relationships of sex workers, including partners who exploit women's prostitution earnings, who coerce continued involvement in sex work, even when women wish to exit, and who exercise control through patterns of violence, threats, and psychological abuse that trap women in situations of extreme exploitation. The intersection of prostitution and intimate partner violence creates complex situations where women may be simultaneously victims of trafficking under legal definitions that emphasize coercion and control, and partners in relationships that they may not themselves perceive as trafficking due to emotional attachments, economic dependencies, or normalized violence that makes abusive relationships seem inevitable or deserved. The debates regarding appropriate legal frameworks for prostitution in contemporary England continue to reflect fundamental disagreements about the nature of sex work, the possibility of meaningful consent under conditions of economic inequality and gender subordination, and the relative priority of different policy goals, including harm reduction, gender equality, public order, and individual autonomy. The abolitionist feminist position advocates for adoption of the Nordic model that would criminalize purchase of sexual services, while decriminalizing those who sell sex, with proponents arguing that this approach correctly identifies prostitution as a form of male violence against women that can never be freely chosen under patriarchal conditions, and that reducing demand through criminalization of clients represents the most effective means of eventually eliminating the sex trade while protecting women from criminal penalties. The detailed arguments advanced by abolitionist feminists emphasize research suggesting that the vast majority of women in prostitution experience violence, trauma, and exploitation. That entry into sex work typically occurs under conditions of vulnerability, including childhood sexual abuse, poverty, lack of alternatives, or coercion by traffickers or partners, and that prostitution reinforces gender inequality by commodifying women's bodies and normalizing male sexual entitlement to access women's bodies in exchange for payment. The Nordic model advocates point to evidence from Sweden suggesting that criminalization of purchase substantially reduced prostitution without displacing it to more dangerous forms, though critics dispute these claims, arguing that Swedish research methodologies were flawed and that prostitution went underground rather than disappearing, while becoming more dangerous for women who continued to work in the trade. The abolitionist position on prostitution connects to broader feminist analysis of rape culture, sexual objectification, and the structures of patriarchy that position women as sexual objects for male use, with prostitution understood as an extreme manifestation of these dynamics, rather than as an isolated issue, disconnected from larger patterns of gender-based violence and inequality. The opposing perspective advocated by sex worker rights organizations and some liberal feminists emphasizes the agency and autonomy of adults who choose to engage in sexual commerce, arguing that criminalization of prostitution harms the individuals it purports to protect by denying them labor rights, forcing them to work in dangerous conditions, and exposing them to violence, arrest, and exploitation by those who take advantage of their illegal status. The arguments for decriminalization emphasize research from New Zealand, which fully decriminalized prostitution in 2003, with studies suggesting that decriminalization enabled sex workers to report crimes to police without fear of arrest, to work together for safety, to refuse clients or particular sexual acts without pressure from criminal laws that increased their desperation, and to access labor rights, including ability to challenge unfair employment practices or exploitative working conditions. The sex worker rights framework rejects the abolitionist characterization of all prostitution as violence, arguing instead that while some individuals in the sex trade experience exploitation and coercion that should be addressed through enforcement of existing laws against trafficking, assault, and coercion, many others engage in sex work as a rational economic choice that deserves respect rather than condemnation or prohibition. The emphasis on sex workers' voices and experiences represents a key element of the rights-based approach, with activists arguing that policy should be informed by the perspectives of those actually engaged in prostitution rather than being imposed by outsiders who presume to know what is best for sex workers without consulting them or respecting their expressed preferences. The divisions among feminists regarding prostitution reflect deeper disagreements about the nature of female agency under patriarchy, with abolitionists arguing that oppressive conditions make truly free choice impossible, and that claims of voluntary participation in prostitution reflect false consciousness or adaptation to constrained circumstances, while sex worker rights advocates contend that denying women's capacity to make meaningful choices about their own lives represents a form of paternalism that paradoxically reinforces the patriarchal structures that both sides seek to challenge. The comparison of prostitution laws and policies across different countries provides evidence regarding the impacts of different regulatory approaches, though interpreting this evidence remains contested with advocates of different frameworks, pointing to the same countries as either successes or failures, depending on the metrics emphasized and the interpretation of available data. The Netherlands legalized and regulated prostitution beginning in 2000, establishing a system where licensed brothels could operate legally, provided they met various requirements, including registration, taxation, labor standards, and health inspections, with the stated goals of reducing exploitation, improving working conditions for sex workers, and combating trafficking by bringing the sex trade into the regulated economy. The evaluations of the Dutch approach have been mixed, with supporters pointing to improved safety for sex workers in licensed venues, better access to health services, and labor rights for those working legally, and successful prosecution of traffickers and exploitative operators who violate regulations, while critics argue that legalization expanded the sex trade, including demand from men traveling to the Netherlands as sex tourism destination, that significant illegal prostitution continues alongside the legal sector, that trafficking persists with victims, often found in licensed as well as unlicensed establishments, and that regulatory burdens and stigma prevent many sex workers from participating in the legal system, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation in the illegal market. The German system of legalized and regulated prostitution, implemented in 2002, has faced similar criticisms, with particular concern about large-scale commercial brothels that operate legally but that have been associated with exploitation, trafficking, and degrading working conditions despite regulatory oversight, leading some German activists and politicians to advocate for abandoning legalization in favor of the Nordic model. The New Zealand decriminalization, implemented through the Prostitution Reform Act of 2003, represents a different approach that removed criminal penalties for prostitution while establishing minimal regulations focused on public health, with evaluations generally suggesting that decriminalization improved sex workers' safety, their willingness to report crimes to police, and their ability to refuse clients or unwanted services, while not producing the expansion of the sex trade or increased trafficking that opponents had predicted. Though critics argue that any policy accepting prostitution as legitimate work fails to address the fundamental exploitation and inequality inherent in commercial sexual exchange. The evidence from countries that have implemented the Nordic model, including Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and more recently France and Ireland, provides additional comparative data, with Swedish evaluations suggesting that criminalization of purchase reduced both prostitution and trafficking by reducing demand, while critics argue that prostitution went underground, making it less visible rather than less prevalent, that sex workers became more vulnerable as they took greater risks to attract clients who feared arrest, and that the promised services to help women exit prostitution received inadequate funding, leaving those who wished to leave the trade without meaningful support. The debates regarding evidence from Nordic countries reflect methodological challenges, including difficulties measuring hidden populations like prostitutes, particularly after criminalization, increases incentives for concealment, the influence of other factors, including economic conditions and migration patterns that affect prostitution, independent of legal frameworks, and the relatively short time periods over which policies have been evaluated, given that structural changes in gender relations and sexual cultures that abolitionists anticipate would occur only over longer timeframes. The complexity of comparing prostitution policies across countries with different legal traditions, social welfare systems, gender equality levels, and cultural attitudes towards sexuality means that evidence from other jurisdictions provides limited guidance for English policy debates, with advocates of different approaches able to selectively cite international examples supporting their preferred policies, while dismissing contradictory evidence as reflecting unique circumstances not applicable to England. The role of advocacy organisations in shaping debates about prostitution policy has intensified during the 21st century, with well-funded and sophisticated campaigns by both abolitionist feminist groups and sex worker rights organisations competing for influence over public opinion and policy makers. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, the European Women's Lobby, and in England groups like Nordic Model Now and Space International have effectively mobilised media coverage, parliamentary attention, and grassroots activism in support of criminalising purchase of sexual services, presenting compelling testimony from women who experienced exploitation in prostitution, and arguing that the Nordic model represents the only approach consistent with gender equality and human rights. The sex worker rights organisations, including the English Collective of Prostitutes, the Sex Workers Alliance, and Scotangent PEP, have countered with campaigns emphasising sex workers' voices, presenting research evidence regarding harms of criminalisation, and building coalitions with public health experts, academics, and some feminists who support decriminalisation, though these groups generally have fewer resources and less access to mainstream media than abolitionist organisations that benefit from more conventional feminist credentials and less controversial positions. The asymmetry in resources and political access reflects the broader marginalisation of sex workers, whose stigmatised status and illegal activity make them less effective political actors than activists who present themselves as speaking for victims of sexual exploitation. Though sex worker activists have achieved some successes, including influencing the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry and maintaining pressure on policymakers to consider impacts on sex workers' safety when evaluating proposed legal changes. The phenomenon of researchers and activists speaking on behalf of sex workers rather than directly amplifying sex workers' own voices represents a continuing tension in prostitution policy debates, with abolitionist feminists often presenting testimony from women who exited prostitution and who reflect on their experiences as exploitation, while treating current sex workers who advocate for decriminalisation as not representative, as suffering from false consciousness that prevents them from recognising their victimisation. The intersectionality of prostitution with other forms of marginalisation, including race, immigration status, disability, and transgender identity, creates multiple layers of vulnerability and complicates policy responses that fail to address the interconnected structures of oppression that shape individuals' experiences. The overrepresentation of women of colour, immigrants, and transgender individuals in street prostitution and in the most exploitative sectors of the sex trade reflects broader patterns of racism, xenophobia, and transphobia that limit economic opportunities and create vulnerabilities that make prostitution appear necessary or appealing despite its dangers and degradations. The particular vulnerability of migrant women to trafficking and exploitation in prostitution stems from multiple factors, including limited English language skills that create barriers to accessing services or reporting crimes, immigration status, concerns that make women fear deportation if they contact authorities, isolation from family and community support networks, and the debts incurred through smuggling or migration that create obligations that traffickers exploit to coerce continued prostitution. The experiences of transgender women in prostitution reflect the extreme discrimination that transgender individuals face in employment markets, where transphobia limits opportunities, in social services where providers may lack understanding or refuse to serve transgender clients, and in broader society, where violence against transgender individuals remains tragically common, creating situations where survival sex work becomes necessity for many transgender women, particularly early in transitions, before establishing stable housing and employment. The movement for transgender rights during the 2010s and 2020s has included attention to the particular vulnerabilities of transgender sex workers, with advocacy for decriminalization as enabling transgender prostitutes to access police protection and labor rights, while also challenging the broader stigma and marginalization that drive many transgender individuals into sex work. The future of prostitution in England will be shaped by continuing technological changes, evolving attitudes toward gender and sexuality, economic transformations, including automation and changing labor markets, migration patterns, and the outcomes of ongoing policy debates about appropriate legal frameworks. The development of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and robotics creates possibilities for technological substitutes for human sexual services, with sex robots and immersive virtual experiences potentially competing with human prostitutes in ways that could reduce demand for the sex trade, though whether such technologies will truly substitute for human connection or will rather create new market niches alongside continuing demand for human sex workers remains to be seen. The continuing evolution of gender relations, including increasing economic independence of women, changing norms regarding marriage and sexuality, and growing acceptance of diverse sexual and gender identities, may affect both supply and demand for prostitution in ways difficult to predict, with some speculating that greater gender equality would reduce both women's need to engage in prostitution for economic survival and men's sense of entitlement to purchase sexual access to women's bodies. The impact of climate change, economic instability, and potential future pandemics on patterns of human migration and economic inequality will likely influence prostitution by affecting the underlying vulnerabilities that drive people into sex work, with increasing global inequalities potentially expanding the supply of individuals willing to engage in prostitution, while economic disruptions might affect demand from clients whose disposable income determines market size. The question of whether prostitution represents an inevitable feature of human societies, an artifact of particular forms of gender inequality and economic organization that could be eliminated through structural changes, or something between these extremes, remains contested, with implications for the appropriate ambitions and strategies of policy interventions. The lessons from 2,000 years of English prostitution history suggest that commercial sexual exchange has persisted across radically different economic, social, legal, and technological contexts, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining essential continuity, raising questions about whether any feasible policy interventions can eliminate, rather than merely regulate or manage, the sex trade. The repeated failures of suppression efforts from medieval church campaigns through Victorian moral reform movements to 20th century criminalization demonstrate the limitations of criminal law as a tool for eliminating prostitution, with women continuing to sell sexual services despite prohibitions, penalties, and stigma, because economic necessity, coercion, or individual choice made prostitution appear preferable to available alternatives. The historical patterns of exploitation, violence, disease, and social marginalization that have characterized prostitutes' experiences across centuries suggest that the harms associated with sex work stem partly from inherent aspects of prostitution as commercial sexual exchange, marked by power imbalances, and partly from the legal and social frameworks that criminalize or stigmatize sex workers, while doing little to address the underlying vulnerabilities that drive people into prostitution. The question of whether harm reduction approaches that accept prostitution as continuing reality and focus on minimizing negative consequences through health services, labor rights, and safety measures represent pragmatic wisdom or moral capitulation to exploitation divides those who prioritize concrete improvements in current conditions for sex workers from those who insist that only elimination of prostitution itself can truly protect women from sexual exploitation. The continuing relevance of prostitution as a social and political issue in contemporary England reflects unresolved tensions regarding gender equality, economic justice, sexual freedom, and the appropriate scope of criminal law in regulating private behavior, with prostitution serving as a flashpoint where competing values and principles collide. The intensity of disagreement regarding prostitution policy among individuals who share commitments to gender equality, human rights, and social justice demonstrates that prostitution raises fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and moral philosophy that admit no easy answers or technical solutions. The importance of centering the perspectives and experiences of sex workers themselves in policy debates about prostitution reflects basic principles of democracy and human rights that require those most affected by policies to have meaningful participation in their development, though tensions between different groups of sex workers, including those currently working in prostitution, who often favor decriminalization, and those who have exited the trade, who more commonly support abolition, complicate efforts to identify what sex workers themselves want. The future direction of prostitution law and policy in England will emerge from continuing democratic deliberation that must balance multiple legitimate concerns, including the safety and well-being of those involved in the sex trade, gender equality and the elimination of violence against women, public health and the control of sexually transmitted infections, community impacts of visible prostitution, and individual liberty and autonomy regarding sexual and economic choices. The history examined in this account demonstrates that prostitution has been and remains a complex social phenomenon that resists simplistic moral judgments or single-factor explanations, instead requiring sustained attention to the intersecting influences of economic structures, gender relations, legal frameworks, technological changes, and individual circumstances that together shape how commercial sexual exchange occurs and what consequences it produces for individuals and communities.